hearing regarding the President's Fiscal Year 2024 budget request. Today, we're delighted to have Director of the Office of Management and Budget, the Honorable Shalanda Young, with us. Welcome. I appreciate your reaching out to me and starting this business relationship and your good faith efforts to work with me and my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle. And today we get the opportunity to unpack and understand the President's vision for this country, and as he says, the values and principles that he believes are best to guide our nation forward. With that, I want to yield myself such time as I may consume for my opening statement. Over the last 2 years, this administration's reckless spending and failed economic policies have resulted in continued record inflation, soaring interest rates, and an economy in a recessionary tailspin with the prospect of a catastrophic, and I would say irreparable, debt crisis looming over the horizon. 2 years. 2 years under this president, $10 trillion in spending, $6 trillion of which has been added to the national debt, all of which has ignited a cost of living crisis for working families who are struggling to survive. Taxing our job creators back to their knees as they try to get back on their feet after a nationwide shutdown. Paying people more to stay home than to go back to work, and waiving work requirements for able-bodied adults, trapping a whole new generation of Americans in poverty and government dependence. Weaponizing, and this is personal for me, being from West Texas, the energy capital of the world. Weaponizing a whole-of-government assault on American energy, the lifeblood of our great economy, a cornerstone of our national security, and the blessing of affordable electricity and gas for families across the country. This administration, I believe, has sown the wind of disastrous economic policies, and the American people are reaping the whirlwind of its cruel consequences. No one can look at our nation's balance sheet or CBO's economic outlook and not shudder to their core at the rapid deterioration of our nation's financial health and our unsustainable spending and debt trajectory. On March 9th, the President had the opportunity to recognize this sober and grim economic reality, reverse course, and show the American people that he understood the painful results of his failed policies. Instead, President Biden doubled down on his reckless spending, radical policies, and the woke and bloated bureaucracy that is bankrupting our nation. The President's budget proposes the highest sustained levels of taxes, spending, and deficits in the history of the United States. In the middle of a spending-induced inflation crisis that is crushing working Americans, the President's budget proposes $82 trillion in spending over 10 years, a spending per GDP that is 18% over the 50-year average and is the equivalent of $100,000 per family of four. $2.5 trillion in increase in the auto spend of mandatory spending, nearly $100 billion in requests or proposals in discretionary spending year over year, a 6% increase over this year for FY24 in discretionary spending. As job creators try to get back on their feet and our economy plummets into a recession, CBO projects that the GDP growth for next year will be a meager 0.1%. As this happens to the greatest economy in the world, and to our families and to our family-owned small businesses, the President levies $4.7 trillion in new taxes on virtually everyone. Small businesses will lose the 20% deduction tax hike. Families will lose marginal rates where they were able to keep, after Republican tax reform, $2,000 more of their hard-earned money in their pockets, in their savings accounts. Tax hike. Doubling the death tax on farmers and ranchers who work hard to give us food security. They pay taxes, federal income, state income, property tax, sales tax. Now, twice the pain of this, what I believe is an unfair, un-American tax and the death tax. Nearly $40 billion in new taxes on American energy producers, which will only drive energy prices further up and penalize folks at the lower economic spectrum who are having a difficult time heating and this summer cooling their homes. And obviously, with energy independence, that will be jeopardized with more taxes passed on to consumers, and less investment, and less domestic energy production, and more dependence on foreign sources. And then finally, the highest rate of corporate taxes in the developed world. We will go back to having a higher corporate tax rate than communist China, so we can wave goodbye to America's competitiveness, say goodbye to the trillions that flowed back to our country, back to our manufacturing, creating more jobs and more opportunity and more prosperity, where all boats rose on the tide of the results of lower tax burden, lower regulatory burden when Republicans had control of Congress. By the way, when I say all boats rose on that tide, 6 million people were lifted out of poverty, the lowest poverty rate in the history. And what will Americans get for this unprecedented expansion and reimagination of the people's government? They're going to get more inflation, more shrinking paychecks, more skyrocketing prices at the grocery store and gas pump, soaring interest rates, more labor shortages, more of a culture of dependency, and overall a weaker economy and a more vulnerable nation. Are we going to get more safety and security for our nation? Nope. More economic freedom and prosperity? Nope. Greater access and lower cost of health care? No. Stronger and more resilient real infrastructure? In sum, are we doing our job as lawmakers of the greatest country in the world, as stewards of taxpayer resources, as fiduciaries of our children's future? Are we giving our children a safer, stronger, freer America? Not even close, in my estimation. Not even close. What I believe we're getting is more wasteful, woke, and bloated bureaucracy, a 20% increase in EPA. And we're asking for more spending. We're in an inflation crisis, and we're asking for 2,400 new climate activists disguised as EPA employees. We're going to get more infiltration of leftist ideology through divisive, in my opinion, divisive politicization of race and sexuality. Not running a better government, not running a more accountable government. The list is long. I'll spare you. But I agree with the president, Madam Director. I agree that budgets aren't just numbers on a balance sheet. They are a set of values and principles. And based on the president's most recent budget, it's clear to me that he values, and this administration values, a bigger, more radical, and more powerful federal government over the freedom, safety, and economic security of his fellow Americans. With that, I'd like to give my colleague from Pennsylvania and friend an opportunity to provide 5 minutes for his opening remarks.
Thank you. He hit the talk button on me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Shalanda, Director Young. It's great to have you back in front of our committee. What a difference 2 years and 2 months make Under President Biden and congressional Democrats' leadership, we have rolled out vaccines and testing, seen a record 12 million new jobs, unemployment at 50-year-plus lows, and have had the strongest manufacturing recovery in this century. Democrats have proven that Congress can deliver for the American people while promoting fiscal responsibility. From galvanizing a record-breaking and world-leading recovery from the COVID pandemic, to rebuilding our infrastructure, to making major investments in America's economic competitiveness, to passing legislation to reduce the deficit, while at the same time lowering costs for American families. President Biden's 2024 budget is exactly the plan we need to build on this progress. And how proud I was to be with the president in my district in Philadelphia 2 weeks ago today when he unveiled this budget. One that lowers families' costs on everything from childcare to prescription drugs, housing to health care. It upholds the promise of Social Security and strengthens Medicare for another generation. It invests in America, in red and blue states, strengthening our communities and our economy. And it makes common sense reforms so that the wealthiest few and big corporations finally start to pay their fair share in taxes, just like the rest of us. Because it is damn unfair that a teacher or firefighter in my neighborhood in Northeast Philadelphia pays a higher percentage of their paycheck in taxes than a billionaire. This budget sets out our next generation for success by investing in their education, from universal pre-K to making college more affordable. It restores the full child tax credit that we passed as part of the American Rescue Plan, and when it was in place, that full child tax credit cut child poverty in more than half. It caps the cost of insulin at $35 for everyone and lowers the cost of other prescription drugs, saving Americans and our government money. Importantly, the Biden budget accomplishes all of this and more while making sure no one who makes less than $400,000 a year pays a penny more in new taxes. These investments are socially responsible, but they're also fiscally responsible. They will put our nation on better financial footing, reducing the deficit by $3 trillion over 10 years, and without taking a sledgehammer to the vital programs that keep our nation and American households secure. Now, that brings me to my next point. I'm deeply concerned by the extreme budget proposals that we're hearing from the other side of the aisle. Now, while we wait for the official Republican budget, we do know there have been other proposals that have been out there, most recently made by the House Freedom Caucus. One idea that seems to be gaining traction with many Republicans is cutting spending to fiscal year 2022 levels. Let me just take a moment to explain what that would do. 2 million Americans would lose access to health care services through community health centers, and more would see their health care costs rise. 640,000 families would lose the rental assistance that helps them stay in their homes. Rail safety jobs would be cut, dramatically reducing inspections. Thousands of police officers, border security agents, and other law enforcement officials will lose pay or worse, their jobs. And those are just a few examples. An analysis by Moody's Analytics found that cutting spending back to fiscal year 22 levels would push our economy into a recession, wiping out 2.6 million jobs and driving unemployment up to nearly 6%. You can't take an axe to the federal budget and then turn a blind eye to people who will suffer the blow. There is a human cost to budget cuts, and I'm concerned that that sometimes gets lost in this town. The president's budget lays out Democrats' plan and our math to achieve $3 trillion deficit reduction, while critically making the needed investments to improve Americans' quality of life. And it's all here for the public to see and, yes, critique. I would ask my Republican colleagues, when will we see your plan? What are you actually proposing that would help working families like my neighbors in Philadelphia? And how can you be so quick to dismiss the president's budget when we've yet to see your own? As we await the Republicans' proposal and markup, I'm glad that we can have this honest and fair hearing and openly debate what is in the president's budget. It is a fiscally responsible and pro-growth document. And Director Young, I thank you for being here to talk about this budget today. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman and my friend, Mr. Boyle. In the interest of time, if any other member has an opening statement, I ask that you submit it for the record. I will hold the record open to the end of the day to accommodate those members who may not have had time to prepare written statements. Okay, now I'd like to recognize Director Young. Director Young, thank you again for your time today. The committee has received your written statement. We appreciate that. We made part of the formal hearing record, and we will now give you 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks, and you may begin when you're ready. Thank you.
Well, I'll use a little of that 5 minutes to echo how you started. Thank you for the relationship you and Ranking Member Boyle have. We all have differences. We've talked about this, very strong differences, but we've agreed to disagree but not be disagreeable. And you have my commitment to do that.
Thank you.
As we progress through this process. I also want to thank your staffs. 2 years ago, I sat where you sat in a slightly less nice room in the Appropriations Committee, so you shouldn't let them visit this hearing room. But thank you. I know it takes a lot to put on hearings like this. But thanks for having me here, the chairman, the ranking member, the members of the committee, for the chance to talk and discuss the president's 2024 budget. This president came into office with a very clear plan to grow the economy from the bottom up and the middle out, not the top down. And over the past 2 years, in the face of significant challenges, that strategy has produced historic results for the American people. Under the president's leadership, we've added more than 12 million jobs, more jobs in 2 years than any president has created in a single 4-year term. The unemployment rate has fallen to 3.6%, one of the lowest rates in over 50 years. We've taken action to lower prescription drug costs, health insurance premiums, and energy bills, while driving the uninsured rate to historic lows. And the president's economic plan is rebuilding America's infrastructure, promoting workers, and fueling a manufacturing boom that is strengthening parts of the country that have long been left behind. The president has done all of this while delivering on his commitment to fiscal responsibility. During his first 2 years in office, the deficit fell by more than $1.7 trillion, the largest decline in American history. And the Inflation Reduction Act will reduce the deficit by hundreds of billions of dollars more over the next decade. The president's 2024 budget details a blueprint to build on this progress and finish the job. It's built around 4 key values: investing in America, lowering costs for families, protecting and strengthening Social Security and Medicare, and reducing the deficit. And it does all of this while ensuring that no one earning less than $400,000 per year will pay a penny more in new taxes. The budget more than fully pays for its investments, cutting deficits by nearly $3 trillion over the next decade by asking the wealthy and large corporations to begin to pay their fair share and cutting wasteful spending to special interests. The budget builds on the progress made over the last 2 years and proposes additional policies to lower costs for working families, including for health insurance, prescription drugs, child care, utilities, college, housing, energy, and more. When working families have a little bit more breathing room, they help power our economy. The president believes that Social Security and Medicare are more than just programs. They are promises we have kept to generations of America's seniors. The budget keeps that promise, protecting and strengthening these programs without cutting benefits for our seniors who have paid into these programs their entire working lives. It also invests in America and working families. The budget will bolster manufacturing, make our communities safer, provide paid leave, support research in cancer, deliver for our veterans, cut taxes for families with children, and more. These investments will pay dividends for decades to come. And in what will be a decisive decade for America and the world, this budget reflects the national security strategy by including robust investments in military readiness, our diplomatic and development tools, and honors the sacred commitment to our veterans. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, for allowing me to appear before the committee and talk about the President's 2024 budget.
Thank you, Director Young. We will now begin the question and answer session. I'll start yielding myself 5 minutes. I'm not trying to trap you. I'm not trying to stump you, but I'm going to go straight to the numbers here. This is the President's budget, and I'd like to walk through some of the figures that are in here. I'm not suggesting you've memorized this, but in summary, table number 1, what is the 10-year average of spending as a share of the economy?
Mr. Chairman, in next year, so the 2024 budget, our outlays are projected to be $6.9 trillion, about 25% of GDP.
Okay, thank you. So you've answered correctly, and I appreciate the transparency. That almost 25% of GDP in spending over the 10 years is the highest sustained level in America's history. Now, if you look at OMB's historic table 1.3, the summary of receipts, outlays, and surpluses or deficits, the federal government spends in every year as a share of GDP more than any year dating back to the invasion of Normandy, pre-COVID. It's not a year where in every year of the budget, we're not spending more as a percentage of GDP than any and every year pre-COVID all the way back to World War II. Do you know that to be true and believe that to be correct?
Mr. Chairman, I haven't seen that analysis, but I will take your analysis and for fact, and happy to look at it after the hearing.
Thank you. I think just about every economist on the left or right, and I certainly recall Larry Summers briefing a group of bipartisan members of Congress where he talked about the bathtub of federal monies, stimulus monies, flooding the marketplace and igniting what has now been 15 consecutive months of 40-year high inflation. I think the cumulative inflation increase is about 15% since the president took office. Do you agree, while there are monetary policy factors, and I'm certain others, that spending is one part of the problem that has created this record inflation that our working families are struggling with today?
Mr. Chairman, I think the largest part of the inflation story is economies coming out of pandemics. That is why we've seen inflation around the globe. So it's not one bill passed by the United States Congress, but supported by the president. When you've seen inflation levels like we've seen them in the UK and France, what explains that? It tells us the pandemic, supply chain shortages, shipping companies, lack of competition certainly had a larger role.
Do you think spending has any role?
It absolutely can. I think it had a small role given what we've seen over the global economy.
What I would tell you is most economists on the left, advisors to Democrat presidents, have said it plays a significant role. And there were warnings. Don't spend $2 trillion, for example, in ARPA monies when $1 trillion remained unspent. Work with Republicans, find out where there are targeted needs, but don't flood the market with trillions of dollars in more spending. It's the old saying, when you're in a hole and you want to get out, the first thing you have to do is stop digging. But my concern is year over year, just on discretionary. I recognize that the longer term's more directional and visionary and aspirational, but next year's discretionary proposal is almost $100 billion more than last year. I just, it's hard to understand when people are having to tighten their belts, they're changing their spending habits, they're struggling to make ends meet, and the president is asking, not just for the $2.5 trillion in mandatory spending and all the things we've talked, but next year, $100 billion more in spending. Let me get to my last point, and I'll yield to my colleague. I'm from a border state. We are struggling and suffering with lawlessness and chaos like we have never seen. And everybody's overwhelmed. Border Patrol's overwhelmed. Hospitals are overwhelmed. Schools are overwhelmed. And the whole country is struggling with the flood of crime, gangs, and especially the drugs. Over 100,000 Americans have died last year, and it seems to only be getting worse. The president, with all due respect, and his Secretary of Homeland Security says, the border's secure. My people in Texas, and I'm certain because of the effects, the pervasive effects of the open border on all states, I suspect people across the country find that not just hard to believe, but insulting to say the border is secure. Maybe embracing open border policies and just accepting that as the policy and saying that's what I believe is the best for the country, that's different. But saying it's secure is insulting. But the budget, when you think about safety and security being the first and most important priority of the government, providing a common defense, you mentioned the investment in the military. The president's budget cuts Homeland Security by $600 million. So here we are in this unprecedented border crisis. I can report from my state, direct impact in my communities, in my district. And the president says we need 2,400 new EPA employees, 20% increase in EPA, but $600 million less for Homeland Security. I'm gonna just let you finish with my Q&A with an answer to that, because I don't know that there's gonna be an answer that's going to satisfy
I hope
my
it
folks.
does. I hope it does, because we agree with you. We have to have, from a funding perspective, and not everything can be fixed with money, but in the border, we recognize more money is needed. We asked for money in December. We got a little over half. So we hope to partner and do a bit better than getting half of our budget request. We're asking for close to 9%, Mr. Chairman, an increase in DHS, about $6 billion. TSA passenger fees are treated differently in '23 than '24, and that accounts for the majority of the difference you cite. Apples to apples, budget authority to budget authority. The Department of Homeland Security would receive 6% more with the passenger fee change alone. If you give us credit for the $5 billion almost we're asking for the Border Search Fund, which I think should count because it's money we're asking for, that goes up to a 9% increase. So I hope that's a place we can work together.
Well, I will not bogart the time. I've resented some of my chairmen in the past who continued this dialogue without giving my colleagues the opportunity. I would respectfully disagree with the characterization of investing in border security, but I appreciate your response. Now, to my friend from Pennsylvania, your Q&A, you got 5 minutes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wasn't planning on asking this, but just it was good dialogue around the American Rescue Plan, and I want to present some facts that weren't mentioned, although we mentioned it both in our opening statements. Can you state again how many new jobs have been created in the last 2 years?
I said over 12 million is 12.4.
And is there any 4-year period in American history where you saw that many new
No.
jobs created?
No.
And was that projected by any independent analytics firm or CBO just
No.
a couple years ago? Are you aware that CBO, as well as others, have directly stated that the American Rescue Plan is part of the reason for our strong recovery?
I am.
And are you aware of any other OECD country coming out of COVID that has had as strong growth and a strong job creation as the United States of America?
I do not.
Thank you. Now, I was struck, I noticed your testimony last week over in the Senate, and I was struck by some of my Republican colleagues in that chamber have kind of foggy memories. Perhaps it goes with serving in the Senate, but be that as it may, let me help clear up the record, since some seem to be confused on that other side. Senator Romney, Senator Scott, Senator Lee, Senator Graham, Senator Thune, as well as others in this chamber, have explicitly called for benefit cuts to Social Security. And if any one of them doubt that, I'm happy to provide those quotes for the record. Let me quote one exactly, Senator Mike Lee. He has said, and I quote, "It will be my objective to phase out Social Security, to pull it up from the roots, and to get rid of it," end quote. So, on the other hand, the president's budget makes it pretty clear that there will be no cuts. But there seems to be some confusion out there as to this matter. So can you please talk about the prospect of Social Security cuts that some have clearly called for in relation to the president's budget?
Well, you've laid out some of the history there. I'll just talk about what the budget does on Social Security. The president fully funds. Budget is about values, and he strongly believes that benefits should not be cut for seniors who have paid into this program, and his budget reflects that value.
Thank you. Would you be able to, because there's an inside baseball term, this is my characterization of it, there's an inside baseball term in this town, non-defense discretionary, that most regular people, most normal people, frankly, have no idea what the heck that means. So when some on the other side talk about cutting non-defense discretionary, that might sound reasonable to some. Could you give some real-life examples of what exactly we're talking about if we saw cuts to non-defense discretionary?
Sure, I'll start with one we just had a discussion about, border security. That is a non-defense discretionary. Veterans medical care is a non-defense discretionary. Our law enforcement, state and local grants is in discretionary. FBI is in discretionary. Rail safety, air safety, TSA, wait times, Pell grants, child care block grants, Head Start, WIC, housing vouchers, to name a few.
And those are just a few.
To name a few.
Yes. Well, let me, just because I want to, like the chairman pointed out, in the past when chairs and a ranking member, not necessarily in this committee, but have exceeded or taken up their time, if you're kind of on the end of the dais, it can be a little painful. So I will just stop there. We'll yield back. And thank you again, Director Young, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Boyle. And now we will recognize our fellow members, starting with the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Ralph Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Young.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Young. I appreciate you taking the time to come. I'm a real estate developer. I don't think I've ever seen a time like this where this country is in the shape that it's in. So goes housing, so goes the economy. I will tell you, because of this administration, the housing is pretty much tanking, and I'm in a state that that is supposed to be booming. To talk about his budget, let me just go over a few things. And as I get out and talk to the people, the businesses in this country, and indicate, and when I tell them some of these things that is in this president's budget, when you see $3 billion to advance gender equity and equity among the bronze-range sectors, I hear nobody saying this is a national concern. I appreciate my money going there. When I see the mention of climate change 42 times, LGBTQ 7 times, diversity 16 times, For the mom and dad trying to run a business, I don't hear them saying, yay, this is a great thing. This is a good use of my tax dollars. $1 billion for Central America and Haiti, again, with no policy changes to rein in the illegal immigration, to go into Haiti. $430 million for hemispheric migration management. Now think about that, hemispheric migration management. What is that? Where's the return on the investment? You know, the list goes on and on. When you talk to the mom and dads who are concerned about this, when I hear that this administration is doing when I see what they're doing, to say he's not proposing a tax increase on those making $400,000 is really so disingenuous. I hear no one saying, you know, I'm excited about paying $76 more for eggs. I'm excited about paying $129 more for dairy products, for milk, if you can find it. I'm excited about $207 more for fruits and vegetables. I'm excited about paying 50% more from gasoline than was under the Trump administration. $465 more for electricity. It goes on and on. And I hear no one saying that times are good. Have you asked the questions that I just asked to that mom and dad, to that family trying to go to work, to that dental hygienist who cannot afford insulin because of just what I named you? Have you hit this, or am I totally in a foreign land?
Oh, Congressman, if you know me, I have a 16-month-old, so I'm one of those parents. And I'm also from a town of less than 2,000 people. We don't quite have a stoplight, but a caution light. And when I talk to them, they are interested in things proposed here, like bringing down costs of child care, the paid leave proposals here, many of them having to make difficult choice with elderly parents that can't take off work without losing their job.
But specifically, what I mentioned, those are everyday items that all of us are having to buy. Those numbers are either they're fabricated or they're true. Would you say they're true, or are they fabricated?
I will say we have proposals that help American families lower costs. This president has made it clear bringing down inflation and cost for goods is his #1 domestic priority. So we agree. We should work together to pass some of these proposals that would help families with child care, that would help families make sure they can take care of
I'm running out of time.
Okay.
Let me just say, I just named a few of the insane items of where our money's going. Janet Yellen's proposed multinational tax of 15%. Is that going to help companies come back to America? Is that a good sign to send? 15% tax on multinational companies.
Congressman, that is absolutely the goal here.
Okay.
Many companies leave to go to countries that don't have any taxes.
Okay.
This
It's
says
time to
they
put,
should
I
have a
reclaiming my
minimum
time.
tax.
Reclaiming my time. It's time for somebody in this administration to put America first. It has been completely last under this administration. I resent it, and hopefully we're going to have a change sooner rather than later. Thank you so much for appearing.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from South Carolina. Would now yield 5 minutes to my friend, Mr. Higgins from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, thank you very much for being here. You know, all of America experienced and the world experienced a pandemic beyond human comprehension, unprecedented. The lives that were lost throughout the world, in this country, the money that was lost, Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, under a Republican administration initially, had to come up with something to save the American economy, to save the world economy, and to save a lot of lives. And we did what we had to do. Under the previous administration, the debt ceiling was increased 3 times. $8 trillion of debt was accumulated during that period of time. Are we in a period of uncertainty right now? Yes, we are, of course. Coming out of a pandemic for 36 months, with all the money that both Democrats and Republicans supported, we had too much money chasing too few goods. Consequently, we had inflation. that was very high. Bloomberg Analytics did a series with all of their economic columnists to talk about the Biden administration and the 10 metrics by which it will be judged. And the initial narrative said that Biden is on track to become the greatest jobs-producing president in the history of America. 12 million jobs created in 2 years, more than any administration in a period of 4 years. The unemployment rate down to 3.4%, the lowest in 54 years. Yes, inflation is still high, but the forecast, based on Bloomberg Analytics, is at this time next year, the inflation rate will be at 2.25%, normal by historical standards. So we have a budget that's been proposed by the administration that is $6.9 trillion. We have a $23.5 trillion economy. That budget is nearly 30% of the entire economy. If we were to default on this budget, as some are threatening, you would see $20,000 lost in retirement savings by every American. You would see the stock market fall by 1/3. You would see the elimination of $12 trillion of family savings, 2.6 million jobs lost, and the economy would drop by 5%. The responsible thing to do is to come up with a budget that people can live with, but can also help grow the economy. I would submit that the Biden budget, if it does one thing that is clear and compelling, it is investing in the growth of the American economy. This is, in fact, what we need after 36 months of hell. So the chairman spoke of issues of lawlessness and chaos, and there are several budget proposals that I've reviewed. One by the Republican Study Committee plan. It would balance the budget in 10 years. To do so, and by the way, 173 of 122 Republican House members are part of the Republican Study Committee. To do so, you would have to cut Social Security by 4%, Medicare by 24%, Medicaid, child health insurance by 49%, other spending, food assistance, farm subsidies, military retirement, anti-poverty programs, 60%, veterans health, transportation, education, law enforcement, 49%. If they were to, and there's several plans out there, but if you're not hitting Social Security and Medicare, which you are in this plan, let's say you just take those off the table in military spending. What does that do to the law enforcement budget to address the lawlessness and chaos that the chairman speaks of?
Well, I gave the ranking member a list of things that we call non-defense discretionary. I noted FBI, other law enforcement like Marshal Service, billions of dollars in grants to state and local law enforcement agencies. CBO has looked at proposals that would, if they did not touch Social Security and Medicare, and you want to balance in 10 years, those things go away in non-defense
Excuse
discretionary.
me, the federal funding for law enforcement agencies, that's like the COPS program?
That is correct. COPS, Burn Jag, the whole host of things that go out to state and local law enforcement prosecutors from the Department of Justice budget.
So it would adversely affect law enforcement and the prosecution of criminals.
Well, you wouldn't have more cops in the beat. This president's asked for 100,000 more. You couldn't do that, and you'd also lose.
I
Thank
thank
you.
the
Yield back.
gentleman
Thanks.
from New York, and now would recognize gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Madam Director, my concern with this budget and the ideology that has produced it is that it takes us far from the fundamental principles that have produced the prosperity and freedom that Americans once enjoyed. Except for World War II and the COVID panic, the sheer size of spending is unprecedented, both in its amount and as a percentage of GDP. Free markets are inherently democratic because every consumer, every day, votes with every dollar that they spend on what they want the economy to produce and at what prices they're willing to pay. When you take the dollar they would spend for their needs and instead spend it yourself for whatever lofty purpose, you've not only reduced their standard of living, but you've also harmed the economy by moving it away from producing what consumers need to what government officials want. Of course, it's necessary to pool our resources to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare, but the farther that we stray from these core responsibilities, the more we damage our prosperity and our freedom. You might think you're helping people, but you're not. In a free market, the only way to make a dollar is to figure out what somebody else needs and provide it for them better than they can provide it for themselves. If I take a dollar from Peter and give it to Paul, Peter's earned that dollar by helping others. Paul hasn't. I take a dollar from Peter and give it to Paul. Paul's got an extra dollar to spend, that's true. But Peter now has one less dollar to spend in that same economy. And here's the real damage. You've robbed both of a dollar's worth of incentive to help each other. Peter, because he no longer benefits by helping others for that dollar, and Paul, because he no longer needs to. And I also find this argument between deficits and taxes to be silly. They're the same thing. A deficit is simply a future tax in the form either of debt or inflation. It's all driven by spending. Taxes harm the current economy, borrowing harms the future economy, and inflation hollows out people's savings and purchasing power. That's why no country has ever taxed and borrowed and spent its way to prosperity. Just as you can't drink yourself sober, you can't spend yourself rich. Now, you used your entire presentation telling us how great the economy is. Well, the problem is you can't spin the economy. People know perfectly well what's going on in their own lives, and trying to tell them otherwise only makes you look foolish. You need to stop that. Americans are soon going to ask themselves, are we better off today than we were 4 years ago? And you'd better have a better answer than doubling down on policies that 2/3 of Americans are desperately trying to tell you to put their families and their country on the wrong track. Instead of looking for new ways to spend money, we should all be looking at ways to save it. Republicans have a lot of suggestions we're trying to share with you. Require able-bodied adults to work as a condition of receiving benefits. Stop flooding the labor market with illegal aliens. Stop subsidizing political cronies whose products people don't want to buy. Stop sending money to countries that hate us. Stop bailing out banks from their own bad decisions. Get out of the way and unleash America's energy resources. I could go on. Bill Clinton reached across the aisle in 1994 and declared that the era of big government is over. Together, a Democratic president and a Republican House achieved some remarkable things. Together, they reformed the welfare system. They cut spending as a percentage of GDP. They produced what amounted to the biggest capital gains tax cut in history. They balanced 4 budgets in a row, and they produced the biggest economic expansions in our nation's history. We can do that again if you decide to join us. But in the meantime, I guess I've just got a simple question for you. What makes you think that socialism is going to work any better here than everywhere else in the world it's ever been tried?
Mr. McClintock, I'll just add one thing to the Clinton administration. Taxes as a percent of GDP were 19.6%, very similar to what we're proposing here. So part of the solution is a tax policy that asks the wealthy and large corporations to pay more. I have a simple proposition too, and this is where we differ. The oil industry had $200 billion in profit last year.
Director
One
Young,
loophole closure would save
Director
$31
Young,
billion.
do you not understand that corporations don't pay corporate taxes? A corporate tax can only be paid in one of 3 ways. It's paid by consumers through higher prices, it's paid for by employees through lower wages, and it's paid for by investors through lower earnings. That's your retirement fund. So when you say you're only taxing corporations, what you mean is you're raising the taxes on every consumer, every employee, and every investor.
I thank the gentleman from California and now recognize my good friend, Mr. Peters from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having the hearing, and thank you, Director Young, for testifying today. I'm so proud of one particular accomplishment last year, which was a bipartisan bill to improve the nation's infrastructure, something people had been talking about for a long time here, even week to week. But we actually did a decade's worth of infrastructure investment. And among the many lessons that we learned and addressed in the pandemic is how crucial broadband access is for families and businesses to stay connected in today's world. That's the access to opportunity, that's the access to information. The Affordable Connectivity Program helps bridge the gap for families that otherwise could not afford broadband access, connecting more than 16 million lower-income households in rural and urban districts since its creation in 2021. I want to make sure that the White House does support ensuring the program has the resources necessary to continue funding once it runs out early next year.
Absolutely, and can I also say thank you for the bipartisan infrastructure law. This broadband program will bring high connectivity to 15 million households. We saw kids in parking lots of McDonald's. That should not happen in this country, so thank you for that.
We will expect continued funding after.
Yes, when we've gotten through this initial investment, our commitment is to work to make sure the progress does not stop.
Great, thank you. You know, one of the things we're all concerned about in this committee is the concession of the Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, which could be insolvent in 5 years. But President Biden has proposed to extend the solvency of Medicare by 25 years or more. Can you explain how this budget proposes to extend the solvency of Medicare?
I will, and I want to thank Mr. Doggett, who has worked on this program for many, many years. And the president's policy aligns with his and goes a step further, where we take the net investment income tax that was always intended to go to solvency and move that over to help the trust fund. We also close loopholes. Some wealthy have found ways, legal ways, not to pay into Medicare. We close those. And we also ask those making more than $400,000 to pay 1.2% more, up to 5%, while middle-class working families continue to pay 3.8%.
Great. And how long will you anticipate that will extend the?
Not just our estimates, but the actuaries at a CMS estimate at least 25 years.
Great, thank you. Finally, the Republican Study Committee didn't come out with a budget, but they last year replaced Medicare as a guaranteed benefit with a subsidy to purchase private insurance. It also raised the Medicare eligibility age from 65 to the normal age for Social Security, which ranges up to 67. And the subsidy wouldn't cover enough of the costs, and out-of-pocket increases for seniors would be significant under that approach. The president's budget takes a different approach and protects Medicare by extending its life for 25 years or more. Can you tell us a little bit about your reaction to the RSC budget and the differences between the president's budget and the RSC?
I won't talk about individual proposals, but what I'll say is this. His president is clear. He would not support benefit cuts, Social Security or Medicare, as a proposal that would extend the solvency of Medicare. And anything that would raise out-of-pocket costs for seniors is effectively a benefit cut.
Okay, I'm willing to work with my colleagues throughout this committee on ways to solve this problem. I just think the draconian approach we saw from the RSC, which is the only suggestion we've seen so far in an official way from the other side, is not going to be acceptable, and look forward to continuing discussions, and thank you again for your work.
I thank the gentleman from California and now recognize my friend from Wisconsin, Mr. Glenn Grothman.
Thank you. Obviously, a budget is a long thing to go through, and I hope I caught everything, but I don't know. I don't see any work requirements here for what the public would call welfare, like EBT, food stamps, that sort of thing. Did you decide to put any work requirements in there?
Mr. Grothman, you know work requirements are a part of several of those programs already. We have not changed those work requirements.
Okay, there are a lot of people are getting stuff without work requirement, but you have not changed that. Next question. On the child tax credit, historically, that can be $3,600 for a child under 5, $3,000 for a child over 5. So if you have like 4 kids, that's can be $14,000 a year. Most recently, there were work requirements to get that child tax credit. You wouldn't just be able to walk down and get another $1,200 a month. It looks to me like that you're changing the law so that you no longer have to work for that, but it becomes an outright, like I said, if you have 4 kids, it can be an outright $14,000 a year, tax-free gift. Is that what we're doing here? Are we increasing the amount you get for not working by that amount?
Mr. Grothman, what we're trying to do is in 2021, the child tax credit was raised. There is a child tax credit now. And in 2021, we raised that amount from $2,000 to $3,000 for older children, $3,600 for younger children. What we saw, and I think many analyses were done, was that child poverty was cut in half in this country. So we are trying to go back to the policy we saw work in 2021.
Just so I understand, I mean, I'm sure if we gave everybody, $30,000, there'd be no poverty in the country, but the question is whether that's good public policy. You are changing the rules to remove the work requirement for that child tax credit, right?
We're not doing that. We're changing the amount so families have more in which to help their children.
Okay, so you're giving them more whether they work or not. Next question. And I think it therefore would encourage what I'll call the welfare lifestyle. Don't work, don't get married, and you still have a substantial sum of money. Next question. We talk about the unemployment rate, but even more significant is what I call the labor participation rate. It looks to me like, we were floating around 63.5, that sort of thing before the COVID. We're still down around 62.4. So there's been a drop in the labor participation rate, which I think is a lot more relevant than the unemployment rate. Is that true? Has there been a significant drop in labor?
You stated the figures. We are almost back to pre-pandemic. The good news is prime age workers, those 25 to 52, I believe is the age, we are back to pre-pandemic levels, and that is what you want to see with prime wage workers.
Okay, but we're down about a full percentage point.
Overall.
Overall, correct. Another question with regard to the calculation of labor force participation rate. There are many people out there working, making maybe $14,000, $15,000, $16,000 a year. And if you talk to employers, you hear there are a lot of employees today, because of the generosity of government benefits, who don't want to work more than, maybe 20 hours a week or 15 hours a week, because then they begin to lose their benefits. So if I'm somebody working 25 hours a week or 20 hours a week, and one of those people who are telling my employer I don't want to work any more hours because I'm going to begin to lose benefits, is that taken into account in the labor force participation?
Mr. Grothman, I think most American families, regular folks that I was asked if I talked to earlier would tell you they have a much more complicated story about why they choose to work. My guess is, because I've been there, the figure you stated, 14,000, pays about half of my child care bill. So families have a very complicated dynamic in which to make sure their kids are taken care of and balance that with their salary.
I think you got to get out in the real world a little bit. I'm going to ask you again. Does that take into account people who are telling their employer, I can't make more than X and X because I'll lose my government benefits?
What I'm telling you is families have very complex dynamics
They're complex.
that we should all take into account.
Okay. Now, there are many, many spending increases in here to hire more bureaucrats, to increase diversity of a variety of different programs. And a lot more money here for Planned Parenthood. These grants to Planned Parenthood, as I understand it, will put gals as young as 15 or 16 on contraceptive without their parents knowing about it. Do you think that's good public policy?
Mr. Grothman, 4.5 million people use Title X clinics. What we're saying is we should support that preventative health, which also includes family planning. I don't know if the specific hypothetical you mentioned happens, but I think we should be investing in institutions that cover 4.5 million Americans who receive care there.
It doesn't bother you if people are getting this without their parents knowing?
You can imagine, I won't speak to hypotheticals. If that is happening, I'm happy to look at, and after the hearing, what stories you may have seen.
I thank the gentleman from Wisconsin, and now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Lee from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Good to see you, Director Young. Good luck. You know what question I'd like to ask you, but I'd like to frame it in the context of what the Congressional Budget Office has shown in terms of reducing our defense budget. The president's 2024 budget includes an $886 billion, includes $886 billion for defense spending, which is a 3.3% increase, I believe, over the enacted 2023 level, which included, for the last 2 years, actually, about $37 billion over what the president asked in the prior couple of years. Now, the Pentagon, first of all, has not been audited. No agency in the history of this country has ever failed an audit, and I believe the Pentagon has failed 5 audits. Again, going to the Congressional Budget Office, it has shown that a cut of $100 billion would not impact our national security. We know there's about $150 billion in waste, fraud, and abuse. The taxpayers deserve accountability in terms of how the Pentagon is spending their money. So I can't understand why we would increase defense spending when the Pentagon can't even pass an audit 5 times. So with every $100 billion, according to the CBO, we could power every household with solar energy, hire 1 million elementary school teachers, provide free tuition for 2 out of 3 public college students. We could cover medical care for 7 million veterans and so much more. And so I'm trying to get a handle on how did the administration arrive at this funding level given the increases above what the administration asked for the last couple of years, and how can we justify increasing an agency or a department that has failed 5 audits?
Congresswoman, you probably won't be surprised. I will get that from you. I will get a wildly different belief that we should be doing more on defense from some on this panel today. What we try to do, because you can't, people have strong feelings on both sides, is follow the national security strategy. What is the right amount based on the strategy we have to defend this country, to counter China, it's a very complex world. We also increased something I know you're interested in, as you chair the State Foreign Ops Appropriations Subcommittee, our diplomatic line. It's not an either or. We have to make sure our defense strategy is fully funded and we counter our adversaries and our competitors. We also have to make sure those diplomatic lines, and we're interested in making sure both of those things are robustly funded.
Thank you for that, but I also know that taxpayers deserve some accountability. Everyone must be accountable to spending public money, every agency. It's failed an audit 5 times, and in fact, our 3 legs of our national defense development diplomacy. In the last few years, my budget as chair of State and Foreign Ops was approximately $64 billion. Defense was approximately $750 billion. And so we need, again, some rebalancing if in fact we're going to prevent conflict and wars, and many generals have indicated that to not only this committee but to other committees. And so I would hope that the rebalancing at this point in history with the Biden administration would be looked at very carefully, and also finally accountability for taxpayer dollars. So how do we spend more, again, when in fact the Pentagon has failed 5 audits?
They have not received a clean audit, and I told this to a member last year on this committee, I believe. We need to fix that. I know the complicated answers and the details. The DOD has a lot of property, and I know that weighs heavily into their ability to get a clean audit. But we cannot not follow our national security strategy.
But again, the CBO has indicated that cutting $100 billion would not tamper with nor even touch our ability to ensure our national security. Let me just ask you very quickly, because again, going back to $100 billion, the CTC expansion of the childhood poverty rate, the CTC actually reduced poverty rates among children. What happens if we make it permanent? How would this policy make meaningful changes in child poverty levels?
Well, we saw it, we beta tested in 2021, it cut child poverty in half. So we believe we should bring it back and make it permanent.
And in the president's budget, it's,
He would make the refundability part permanent, but in 2025, we have a lot of tax cliffs, and our proposal would take this to 2025 so we can deal with those
thank you
holistically.
for your answer.
I thank the gentlelady, and I really appreciate, regardless of whether we agree or disagree on how to resource the people's government, and regardless of whether we agree or disagree on specific programs, I really respect the seriousness, the diligence on elevating the level of accountability on, are we getting what we paid for? Not are we, our taxpayers. Is the public impact, the desired goal being met? And so I respect that, and I hope we get more of that throughout this Congress. So with that, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to my friend from Pennsylvania, Mr. Lloyd Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, thank you for being with us today. This budget proposes about close to $5 trillion in new taxes. Am I in the ballpark, Director Young?
4.7, so
4.7 in new taxes. It would be $65 trillion in total taxes over the next 10-year period, which would be record high taxes ever proposed. Agree?
I mentioned some Clinton statistics on percent of GDP, so we'd be in line with where we were in the 90s on percent of GDP revenue.
19.6% of
Correct.
GDP is record high. Mr. Chairman, the Tax Foundation released their analysis of the president's tax proposals this morning. Just very briefly, they find these tax hikes would be devastating for the American people. The burden of higher taxes hits middle-income families, once again breaking Biden's promise. It would cost 335,000 jobs, would reduce wages, and would reduce GDP by 1.3%, which would increase the deficit even beyond what is being proposed here. So, Mr. Chairman, again, this is by the Tax Foundation, released just this morning, the details and analysis of President Biden's fiscal year 2024 budget proposal. Would like to insert that into the record. If we
Without objection, so ordered.
and I'd like to then get back to just a few comments that you made during your open comments. The deficits in particular. Are you concerned with the level of debt that we have now and with the projection going forward?
Yes, that's why you've seen our policies that would bring down the deficit by nearly $3 trillion over 10 years.
Yeah, and this is what I would like to get to. And I asked Secretary Yellen these questions as well, because I can't for the life of me see where you are decreasing the deficit. And I don't think anyone outside of the Beltway looking at these numbers can see that as well. Would agree that you're reducing the deficit. And I think it's important that we, if we recognize that that is a goal, and we need to be transparent and understand what the numbers are. So I have in front of me your proposal from last fiscal year. You were proposing that the deficit at that point in 2023 would be 1.1 trillion. You agree with that number?
If you have last year's table in front of you, I'll agree with it.
1,154 billion. What was the actual deficit in 2023 in your new proposal?
So in 2023, our projected deficit will be,
1,569 billion.
yeah, so in
400
2023, deficit is projected to be 1.6 trillion.
1.6 trillion compared to 1.1 trillion, so it's half a trillion higher than what you were projecting 12 months ago.
I'll just remind you, we're still in the middle of 23, and those deficit numbers will change from this number and that number.
If anything,
Their
will
projections last
probably go up, if anything.
Absolutely not. We actually had lower deficits last year than our budget projected in '22.
It's 40% higher than you were projecting last year at this time.
In 2022, our deficit projections were lower than the 1.7 trillion actually.
Let's look at one more year. Last year at this time, you were projecting a deficit of 1.2 trillion for 2024. That's the upcoming year. What are you projecting in 2024 now?
1.8 trillion.
1.8 trillion. You think that's reducing the deficit?
So you are comparing projection to projection.
I am.
Interest rates have changed since then. Our economic projections have changed since then, unemployment, and that all factors into
I am
the
comparing,
numbers.
I'm comparing what your plan was a year ago
Projections.
to your projections now, correct? Last year at this time, you were projecting 14 trillion in total deficits over the next 10-year period. This year, you're projecting 17 trillion. Where are, that's 3 trillion more in deficits. Where are you seeing reductions in the deficit?
Our deficit numbers, the projection from this year to the budget year in 2033, 10-year budget in '24, I hope you, if you pull out this year's table.
Sure,
it
I have it right
would
here.
show a cumulative deficit reduction of 2.9 trillion, the nearly 3 trillion.
Compared to what?
Compared to where we're starting in this fiscal year.
It's not true.
the end.
This fiscal year, the deficit is 1.5 trillion. What are you projecting in 10 years from now?
The cumulative deficit,
No, but
would
no,
be
you're projecting,
reduced to nearly 3
you're
trillion.
projecting 2 trillion 10 years from now compared to 1.5 trillion. Nowhere,
Deficits are year over year, so if you add the deficit reductions each year, the cumulative addition, we've done a lot of adding of spending over 10 years, so if we do the same for deficits, you add each of the savings, each year there are savings, the total is 2.9
the bottom line
trillion
is,
at
the
the
bottom
end
line
of-
is,
at the
bottom
end of
line, claiming my
2033.
time here, the bottom line is, in 10 years, the deficit will be 2 trillion compared to 1.5 trillion now. We agree that it's important we reduce the deficits. It's really important that we look at these numbers, and the numbers you're looking at, there's no way anywhere anyone outside the Beltway would believe that we're reducing deficits. It's unfortunate
Those are our
that's the case.
estimates if the president's policies are adopted.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I thank my friend from Pennsylvania, but we will now yield 5 minutes to my colleague from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Young. You know, I had hoped this morning we might see some specific Republican alternatives to this budget so you could compare and contrast them with your insight on this, but we seem to only have harangues against the successes of the Biden administration. I'd like to focus your attention specifically on Medicare. I'm pleased that the President included as one of his 4 pillars of his initiative the importance of protecting and preserving Medicare for the future. As you know, I introduced legislation last year that was designed to extend the solvency of the Medicare Trust Fund to 2040 by relying on the net investment income tax and closing a loophole, redirecting all the funds from that tax into the Medicare Trust Fund as was originally intended. President Biden has taken the additional step of proposing a tax on the very top earners that would extend Medicare solvency far beyond 2040. He has been successful, I think, in essentially shaming Republicans into saying that they won't cut Social Security and Medicare, but they don't appear to have offered any alternatives, as he has, as I've tried to do, to assure that Medicare will be solvent and available to pay those benefits. Why do you think the net investment income tax is an appropriate way to finance Medicare rather than the Republican traditional approach of cutting benefits?
Well, one, thank you for your leadership, as I said earlier. The president's proposal has a lot of similarities to what you put forward last year. The net investment income tax, the NIT, was always intended to go into the Medicare Trust Fund. And so it is appropriate and based on people who helped start that during the ACA conversation, that should have always helped solvency in the trust fund. So we do that proposal like you also had. We close loopholes, I believe like your bill did as well, ensuring that the wealthy pay into Medicare Trust Fund, the same as everyone else who goes to work. We go a click further by saying those making over $400,000 should pay 1.2% more than middle-class families, and those making under $400,000 by paying 5%.
Thank you very much, and certainly that contrasts with the only Republican budget we have out here, which is the Republican Study Committee, which proposes to privatize Medicare and really eliminate it as a guaranteed benefit. Let me ask you also about a second aspect of that, and that is to assure Medicare's fiscal health. I'm concerned about tens of billions of dollars that are lost in provider fraud. These are not victimless crimes. They impact the security of the Medicare program. I've introduced a Medicare Fraud Detection and Deterrence Act to close a shocking loophole that CMS does not apparently have authority to take away a national provider identifier number that fraudsters use to bill Medicare, and it would give CMS that authority. Additionally, I have legislation concerning preventing Medicare telehealth fraud, where without ever seeing a patient, lab tests that are not necessary and very expensive, or expensive services and equipment, or provided to someone through telehealth. There have been billions of dollars that have been the subject of Justice Department action trying to do something about this, but the key, I think, has to be preventing this fraud from ever occurring in the first place. And I would just ask you if I can count on your office and CMS to work with us in securing scores on the savings that can be achieved to Medicare by devoting our efforts to preventing fraud from providers before it ever occurs.
I don't want to speak for the CMS administrator, but I think I know her well enough to speak for both of us when we say we'll be happy as an administration to work with you on that.
Thank you so much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Texas, and now would yield 5 minutes to my friend, Mr. Klein from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am concerned by this budget request because deficits, as far as the eye can see, into perpetuity is not the way we're going to achieve fiscal responsibility in this country for the future of this country, for the future generations of this country. We owe it to them to rein in the excessive spending that we've seen over the past several years, particularly over the past 2 years. One of the existential threats facing this country is our level of debt, our excessive deficits, now over $1 trillion a year and growing by all accounts over the next 10 years under the president's budget. Another threat to this nation is immediate and direct and is on our southern border and is being ignored by this president. I see that last year Congress enacted $61 billion for Homeland. This year the budget proposes, and I'm just reading a number here, $60.4 billion in discretionary budget authority. And I know that you're talking about TSA fees and other kinds of revenues, but that is a cut for Homeland, even in the face of 2.7 million Border Patrol enforcement actions, a 30% increase over fiscal year 2021. And since President Biden's been in office, there have been nearly 4.7 million migrant encounters at the southwest border. The population of Virginia is 8.8, so you're over half of the population of Virginia at this point. That's not counting the 1.2 million known gotaways who evaded Border Patrol agents in the last 2 years. But despite this increase, the Biden administration is looking to cut the appropriation for the department as a whole, including for U.S. Customs and Border Protection and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But at the same time, in a reflection of the values of this administration and their failure to protect the rights enshrined in this Constitution, the President's budget requests $2 billion for the ATF to increase regulations of the firearms industry, among other directives. Can you tell me specifically, of this $2 billion, will any of these funds go toward the enforcement of bans on pistol braces, often used by veterans, assault rifle bans, the creation of a gun owner registry, or the elimination of manufacturer immunity as part of their efforts to increase regulation of the firearms industry?
Let me be very clear what the ATF funds are about. Keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people, implementing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and making sure criminals don't have access to guns, which are being trafficked in this country. That I think is a bipartisan concern. We can do that without infringing on the rights of law-abiding citizens. And on DHS,
So your
I'm happy to
commitment-
submit for the record that DHS is actually getting a 9% increase. So I welcome bipartisan cooperation to provide these resources.
I reject the characterization of it as a 9% increase, but your question is, well, your answer, can you commit that none of these funds will go to the creation of a gun owner registry?
This is, and
Gun owner
I'll
registry,
repeat it.
specific to gun owner registry.
Law-abiding citizens
Tracking gun owner
should have,
purchases.
is not the focus. It is about going after dangerous criminals. Everybody in this country has seen mass shooting after mass shooting after mass shooting, and they are asking us to do more about it. This is what that's about.
So this administration wants to create a gun owner registry to track the lawful purchases of guns by law-abiding citizens. That is a violation of the Constitution, and I think it demonstrates the neglect of this administration to its responsibilities under the Constitution to protect those rights of the citizens. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for Virginia, and we'll yield to my good friend from California 5 minutes, the great salad bowl of the country, Jimmy
Thank you, Mr.
Panetta.
Chairman. I appreciate that. It's an honor to be here with you and the ranking member, and appreciate this opportunity. Director Young, thanks for being here, and thanks for the good work you've done over the past couple of years, especially with your help in passing some historic pieces of legislation that's led to, basically last month, 517,000 jobs created. This month, 311,000 jobs created. Inflation's gone down 3 percentage points to 6%. Unemployment is at 3.4%. The deficit to GDP has fallen from 15 to 5%. The deficit has fallen by 1.7 trillion. Wages are up, savings are up, and boy, are corporate profits up as well. However, obviously, we understand that we want to ensure that we do lower our debt and deficit, but the last thing we want to do is screw around with this thing called the debt ceiling, because if we start to do that, if we even threaten that, basically you're going to see GDP decline by 4%, 6 million jobs are going to be lost, unemployment's going to go up to 9%, and stocks are going to plunge, basically causing a $15 trillion hit to our economy. So look, we got a lot of work to do. We understand that. And obviously there are hardships right now that many working families are facing, but clearly we have a good foundation going forward upon which we can tackle these challenges. Now, some of the challenges that we're facing also have to deal with basically the recent storms in my district that we faced. And I got to admit, I appreciate the fact that you're probably one of 2 directors of the OMB that are familiar with the word pajaro, and you don't even have a personal connection to it. But I appreciate your partnership that we've developed in at least addressing the Pajaro River Flood Risk Management Project there in the 19th Congressional District. Obviously, I've raised the alarms about the risks of the potential failure of flooding in that levee, and unfortunately, just last week, the people of the town of Pajaro experienced what can happen when there is flooding, considering that they're completely out of their town at this point and not able to go back in because of a breach of that levee. Now, there's been an authorization to have this project fixed. Unfortunately, there's been this thing called the BCR, this benefit to cost ratio, that really, I would say, prevented any sort of progress since the authorization since 1966. However, we were able to get $4.8 million for the pre-construction engineering and design. And then I'm glad to say with the IIJA, we were able to sort of put aside, well, maybe that's not the right word, at least get past the BCR in order to get $150 million to get that project started. But unfortunately, based on last week, it came a little too late. So we still got a lot to do to get this project going. I guess my question to you, Madam Director, is can you make sure that, are you still committed to working with us to ensure that we can complete this project before this community is devastated once again in a timely manner?
One, I'll tell you, I'm sorry we were late, and I'm sorry that community has suffered. You're talking to a South Louisiana girl who's helped many friends and family pull out drywall. It is devastating for communities, so I'm sorry. But I'm happy that the bipartisan infrastructure law allowed us to put money towards this critical flood control project, and you have my commitment to continue to work with you. Look, benefit cost ratios are important. They're not the full story. What I have seen, Mr. Scott and others, if you have Army Corps project in your neck of the woods, we have got to look at more than just the BCR. It does not tell the full story. And when you ask, why can't that poor community get a flood wall project? Well, their housing is too low to get a good benefit cost ratio. Something is wrong with that. You have my commitment to work on this in a systemic way, in a bipartisan way, because it shouldn't matter who sits in the seat. We have to look at fair ways in which to judge these projects.
Outstanding. Thank you, Madam Director. I appreciate that and look forward to working with you on that. Just quickly, in the 30 seconds that I have, what is OMB's role in ensuring that the projects from the historic pieces of legislation that we passed, the IIJA, the IRA, are improved in a timely manner? And is it possible to speed up the NEPA process without undermining our environmental protections?
So we have to work in a bipartisan way to streamline permitting. The President's been clear about his willingness to engage here, and we need to do that.
Great. Thank you, Madam Director. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I thank my friend from California. I'm sitting here watching you, observing such good behavior. We serve on Ways and Means Committee, and I don't mean to be a flip about it, but then I look over and see one Leon Panetta, and now I understand why you are behaving so well. If that was my dad, I'd be rubbing my backside the whole time with some tremendous PTSD. But thank you, Jimmy. And now we will yield 5 minutes to my friend Bob Good from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Young, for being back with us again today. Director Young, what do you believe are the greatest threats to our country?
There are a lot of threats. One, we talked about defense.
Just kind of quickly, your 3 or 4.
Yeah, making sure that we have a strong national defense to protect Americans against international threats. I also believe we have to be fiscally responsible. We talked a lot about that today. We have differences on how we get there, but we put forward proposals to do that. I also think we have to look at climate change. We talked about flooding and seeing the cadence of those 100-year floods be every 2 or 3 years. So we have a complex environment we have to solve for.
Okay, so you would identify national defense, national security as one, the national debt as another, or spending?
Yeah, we have to be diligent.
How much national debt do you think is too much?
So that is a good question. One I hope we all take a look at. We believe one thing to look at is real net interest.
No, just how much national debt do you think? When does national debt become a problem? How much?
I personally don't believe looking at a gross number tells the story. I think you have to look at percent of GDP. I think you have to look at the cost of servicing debt. Most economists will tell you it is more.
If I may, how much is our national debt now?
The national debt, if you look at just public debt, is a little over $24 trillion.
Our total national debt is how much?
If you add in debt that other government trust funds
our total national debt is how
take it
much?
to over $31 trillion. But that is government to government.
And how much does that equate to per American citizen?
I have not divided by the number of citizens, but you know we don't pay the debt that way. We don't go out and tax individuals.
You're
by
correct
debt.
that we don't pay the debt. That's exactly right. We're
That
continuing to
way.
spend more and add to that debt. So let me help you with that. The national debt is about $32 trillion with 330 million American citizens. It's about $100,000 per American citizen. What do you think the average American citizen might say they've gotten for their share of the $100,000 national debt?
Congressman, that is a great question why we're here today. What investments make sense for the American people? And we have a whole suite of proposals about
All right,
lowering
with
costs
us
of
at
healthcare,
$100,000
childcare.
in national debt per citizen, at $32 trillion for 330 million Americans, when would that become an unsustainable problem? When does that become just a tremendous national threat that we've got to deal with in terms of cutting spending? When would that happen?
Congressman, we're putting proposals forward today. The president's policies would bring down the deficit by nearly $3 trillion over 10 years. I know there's disagreement about those, but it's in black and white.
You mentioned our debt as a percentage of national GDP. What is the percentage of debt to national GDP now?
So the percent of debt to GDP last year It was 97%. This year we're in, it'll be 98.4%.
Okay, it's really about 125% because you're not including the whole $32 trillion when you calculate. When was the last time that we had national debt as a percent of GDP as high as it is now? When's the last time in our history we had that?
I'll take that back. I'm not sure when the exact level is, but I'm happy
You would have to go
answer
back
for the
80
record.
years to World War II when we had that level of national debt. Do you see it as a problem? We're not coming out of World War II, the greatest threat to the globe, to the United States, to our national security. Here we have similar 125% debt to GDP, and we're not coming out of World War II. Do you see that as a problem?
Well, Mr. Good, I point out we're coming out of a historic pandemic.
Okay, so what was the peak of the spending during the pandemic? What was the largest amount of budget during the pandemic?
What I'm saying is we are
No, I
coming
want to
out
ask you
of-
that question because you referenced it. We just came through the China virus pandemic, and the highest amount of spending on an annual basis was about how much?
So I can tell you in 2022.
It was about
we outlaid
$6.8 trillion, about
$6.3
$6.8 trillion. Highest ever, highest national deficit ever. Now how much has the president proposed? Now that the virus is over, the pandemic is over, how much has he proposed in the latest budget?
As a reminder, this president pays for all of his policies. So all the spending talked about today, what is not also noted is that this
The
president
answer
has
to my
policies to
question
pay
is
for
we've proposed $6.9 trillion budget,
taxes on the
which
wealthy
is
to
the
pay for
largest
it.
ever after we're coming out of the China virus pandemic. So we're proposing a budget even more. How much does that $6.9 trillion equate to per 330 million American
I'm
citizens?
sure you have the calculation with you.
$20,000 per citizen. Think about that. The president has proposed to spend $20,000 per American citizen. What does the average American citizen get for his or her share? The household of four, $80,000. What are they getting in return for that share in this
Congressman,
president's
this
budget?
president has asked, as you know, billionaires, large corporations to pay more, to pay for these.
Sadly and
investments.
unfortunately, there are
He has
not
asked
enough of
working
those to
families.
pay for this reckless, unprecedented amount of spending. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman Ferguson.
Thank you. Next, we will go to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
Thank you. Director Young, thank you so much for being with us. Just to piggyback off some of the questions that you were being asked that you didn't really have the chance to fully and clearly answer, does the president's budget proposal add to the deficit?
The president's proposal not only doesn't add to the deficit, his policies would reduce the deficit over 10 years by nearly $3 trillion.
And in regards to presidents adding to the deficit, what historical understanding do you have about that?
I've mentioned where I used to sit. I've been in receipt of lots of budgets, and it is not a norm for presidents to send up proposals that pay for their not only spending and investments, but tax cuts.
And would you say that this president has reduced the deficit or increased the deficit in his proposals
presided
over the last 2 years?
He presided over a $1.7 trillion deficit reduction in his first 2 years.
And I know that you have continuously repeated the fact that we find ourselves in this predicament, as many other countries find themselves in this predicament because of COVID. What does that tell us about the fiscal health of our country in comparison to other countries who have also dealt with the pandemic?
That tells us we are much more resilient. We are seeing 2 months ago, over 500,000 jobs added. Last month, over 300,000 jobs added. Most economists would not and did not forecast that level of employment growth.
And there was a question about what are Americans willing to invest in? I know that in the last 2 years, we reduced child poverty by 40%. We invested in addressing the climate change. But I also know that we've been investing in things like housing, creating affordable housing, and making sure people are able to buy housing. The Minnesota Housing Agency estimates that it would take $2 billion per year to secure the housing of all cost-burdened, low-income Minnesotans. I'm happy that this budget addresses this financial need and recognizes this important truth, that housing is a human right. Our state agency has been using federal and state funds to develop transformative programs to expand and maintain our affordable housing stock. One example is Minnesota's down payment loan program centered on racial and economic equity. The agency hopes to have 40% of first-time homebuyer mortgages go to households of color by 2023, and they actually hit this goal much earlier last year. In my district alone, almost 60% of these loans went to people of color in fiscal year 2022. However, this down payment assistance currently relies on state funds and private-public partnership. Federal and state funds have not kept up with demand, so our state agency has had to make up the difference, which has constrained their budget. Could you explain how the president's budget could help Minnesota narrow the racial wealth gap through affordable housing and mortgage lending programs?
I think a lot of Americans still see home ownership as the path to the American dream. Lots of families' wealth is tied into home ownership. That's why this president feels very strongly that we should do everything we can to encourage that, including increasing more affordable housing supply, which we have proposals to do. We also have a first-time homeowner program. $10 billion in total would help 400,000 people. And I want to be clear who would be eligible for that. Those whose parents do not own a home, so I wouldn't have gotten this, and my child won't get this. This is about putting people on a different path and giving them a leg up, a little breathing room, as the president says. Income below 120% of the area median income and covers their down payment and closing costs. So we think that it's incredibly important to make sure new generations of people who have not experienced home ownership and therefore have not created that wealth through home ownership have a chance.
And so you would say these programs help families that we heard talked about earlier who are overwhelmed with housing costs and the ability to afford a house. It would help families be able to feed their children with this budget proposal, that it would help make sure families have jobs to sustain themselves.
At least 400,000 families with this proposal to start. And it's also critical we look at the proposals that would encourage the building of affordable housing. We know there is a housing stock problem in many parts of this country.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Great job. Okay, next we're going to go to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bergman. General.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 6 years ago, there were a few of us on this dais who joined the Budget Committee as freshmen. The first document we were given by the Congressional Research Service was a 24-page document called The Evolution of Federal Budgeting for us to study as new members. I still have that document, and on day one, after review, I retitled it When 2 and 2 Cease to Equal 4. So when I look at basic math, and there's a joke within the Marine Corps, math for Marines, it's pretty simple. What does 2 and 2 equal? So when I ask the questions that in our limited time here in dialogue, if I ask yes or no, I would appreciate a yes or no answer. There's going to be some questions that you'll be able to expand on, but I would appreciate, in the interest of time and the constituents who are listening to this hearing. So let's talk about small businesses. Would expanding Medicare payroll taxes increase the tax burden for small businesses? Yes or no?
Not under 400,000.
Would ending the small business deduction increase the tax burden for small businesses?
Anyone make it under 400,000? No.
Okay. So if, as you said earlier this month, that President Biden would work with Congress to extend the tax cuts for those making below 400,000 that was first passed as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. However, I mean, that was the statement. However, this budget assumes that these provisions will expire as currently scheduled in 2025. So are we telling the folks that after 2025, they're fair game at under 400,000?
Mr. Bergman, this is a 2024 budget, but we felt it necessary to put a statement of principles because we know people would be interested.
Is they, for that person
in-
who's out there, should they expect that after this, that they're going to be fair game?
No. The budget
So-
makes clear that the president would support extending tax cuts for those making
So-
under 400,000.
So we're going to extend them. Is there,
Those making under 400,000.
does the
he's
president
very-
have a plan for that extension so that
black-
the people as they're starting their business or raising their family?
It is in the budget, it's clearly written that the president supports.
It's
keeping
one
those
thing to
cuts for those
support,
under
it's another thing
400,000.
to enact.
Well, we
And
have
I
to
got
work
it. So
with Congress.
I would like to move on here because, again, as the kind of questions I get asked by the folks back home, the president's budget requests a total of $2 billion for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives to, quote, increase regulation of the firearms industry, among other directives. This is despite the fact that the ATF is already reaching far beyond their congressional mandate and pushing new restrictions that violate the Second Amendment. Will this $2 billion of new funding for firearm regulations be used to create new red flag laws, greater burdens on lawful gun owners, blanket bans on assault-style rifles, or elimination of manufacturer immunity? Will any of those occur under this $2 billion expansion?
Congressman, I'm sure you saw the president sign an executive order doing as much as we can administratively to make sure, do whatever we can to stop these mass shootings and keep hands of guns out of prison. So this money would be used to support.
Yes, yeah, and the mass shootings, and no one in this room I know wants to not do everything at all possible to prevent this. Last time I checked, the bad guys don't care about laws. The bad guys don't care about rules. So we can add laws and rules and restrictions all day long, but the bad people don't. So I would suggest this administration and in any future administration consider what drives the behavior. So with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. We'll next go to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Trone. Mr. Trone, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Young, thanks for your leadership at OMB. And I have a number of questions, but is there anything you want to finish on the response to my Republican colleague?
I think we've answered. I thank Mr. Bergman for that last interaction, but I think we've answered everything. I don't want to take your time.
We're good to go. I applaud the president's bipartisan unity agenda, put addiction and mental health priorities 1 and 2, so thank you. President Biden has done more for this crisis than every other president combined, everyone. However, we're still losing. We're going to lose 1 million folks to addiction overdoses in this decade. We're going to lose about half as many, 500,000 to suicides. So tell us a little bit about how this budget prioritizes these important issues, 1, and 2, with freezing the budget at 22 numbers, as the extremist Republicans have proposed, lead to more lives lost.
Like, 1, there's not one community, probably not one person we could throw a stone and hit in this room who's not been touched by mental health disease in their family and addiction issues. And this has been a bipartisan effort to make sure we do everything we can. And I want to thank the members for doing that. It is very clear if we cut, this is non-defense discretionary. That is where we do mental health and opioid grants is out of non-defense. So if you cut that will be cut. But this president's budget goes further than we've gone before. We would invest more than $75 billion in a set of key proposals to transform behavioral mental health care in this country, to address substance abuse and opioids, The budget provides a combined $1.1 billion or 30% more for substance abuse prevention, treatment, and recovery services block grants and state opioid response grants. And I can go on, and I'm happy to provide for the record, but one other thing I want to point out is the $10 billion in mandatory funding for substance abuse SAMHSA, which would be a 40% increase to improve our behavioral health services in this country that are lacking. And also, I want to work with you and others to make sure we have the professionals in that system who have left in droves, because it's a tough job during the pandemic, to make sure we have the people to staff the behavioral health clinics and services.
Thank you very much. There's no question we're short on staffing, and we've got to provide the dollars to get folks to go into these tough areas in behavioral health and mental health and take these jobs, or America's going to be much worse off, for it. Other area that can help Americans is you have a $2.5 billion for ARPA-H. Success rate at NIH on grants is 18 to 19%. When I talked to Director Collins, he's been crystal clear for the last 4 or 5 years. That should be 33, 35%. That means we're leaving lives, tens of thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives on the sidelines that aren't going to be saved. So what would the idea of cutting the 22 levels do on impacting our medical research and saving American lives?
Look, a cut to NIH would take more research grants off the table, meaning we do less in Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, any of those research institutes where I started my career as a civil servant, off the table. And the fewer research grants you do, the less innovation you will see in the biomedical research area.
And I am a capitalist through and through, as most of my Democratic colleagues are, capitalists. And to do that, you have to spend money to save money. Spend money to make money in business, spend money to save money. And that's what these votes on ARPA-H are all about, this money, the money for addiction, the money for mental health. It's all about spending dollars to save hundreds of thousands of lives. So we applaud you for that. The last thing I want to quickly touch is in business, you've got to invest in your infrastructure. I was just at a BOP, the CJS hearing on the Appropriations Committee, and the Inspector General talked about the crumbling infrastructure at the Bureau of Prisons. I saw it firsthand last week at FCI Cumberland with the Director Peters when we spent the day in Cumberland at the prison. And we see the same thing at NIST. Our infrastructure is crumbling. The Chinese are beating us. They've copied NIST 5 times over. We don't have the ability, and we have to invest in infrastructure. So this aging construction often gets left behind. It's not fun, it's not sexy. Members don't ask for it, but we need to invest in construction issues. So any thoughts on that area before I close?
We have $262 million in for construction facilities at NIST. And just to echo what you said, if we want to counter China, we also have to take into account our research space and make sure that we remain leaders in research in this country.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back, and now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy, you are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Director Young, for joining us here today. I would note we've already acknowledged that 19.6% overall percent of GDP revenue to the Treasury, which would put it at historic highs. I assume the Director would agree that that's a relatively high historic percentage of revenue to the Treasury.
Yeah, we would be in line with where we were in the mid-90s.
But nevertheless, those are very high levels as a relative basis of percentage of GDP, but we're also acknowledging that we're increasing spending next year to $6.8 trillion, $500 billion more than FY23. $82 trillion over 10 years. $82 trillion of spending over 10 years. But we're trying to praise a $3 trillion so-called reduction in the deficit, despite the fact we're spending $82 trillion. Here's where I want to kind of go. What are the priorities of this administration when I look at what I see in the budget? Here's some of the spending items that are brought to my attention. $3.9 billion for the Department of Homeland Security Climate Resilience Program. $3.9 billion because the administration cares about a climate crisis more than the crisis at our border. $109 million going to Mexico. Mexico for law enforcement and military support. This despite the fact that our border is overrun and Mexico has lost complete control along our southern border. $3.5 billion for the FBI's new headquarters. $3.5 billion for the FBI to have a brand new headquarters in Maryland. $1.8 billion more for the Internal Revenue Service on top of the $80 billion that was given to the IRS last year. $1.6 billion for the United Nations Green Climate Fund, which includes $100 million to go to China for greening its economy. $108 million for the World Health Organization, which conspired and colluded with the CCP to cover up COVID and parroted the CCP propaganda. I've been combing over the budget to find any reductions in outlays or cuts in this administration's budget. There are precious few. Where I could find a couple of actual reductions was, for example, in reductions to Border Patrol, reductions to ICE, actual cuts to the spending for those particular programs, but that is supposedly offset by $4.7 billion for a new Southwest Border Contingency Fund to respond to migrant surges. But here's the thing. Those are restricted, according to the language that I see. Eligible uses for the funds include soft-sided facilities, transportation detention beds, alternative detention, and shelter and services programs to organizations caring for non-citizen adults. In other words, that is additional money for more processing with cuts and reductions to the actual enforcement of the law. Those are the priorities of this administration. So one thing that I would like to have at the end of this is I would like for the OMB to produce for us a list of specific reductions in outlays throughout the president's budget. Because I'm combing over them and I'm finding precious little reduction in outlays, but the only outlay I could find that was serious reductions were to DHS's Border Patrol and ICE. I would also note that there was $114.7 million for diversity and inclusion activities at the Department of Defense. $114 million for diversity and inclusion activities. The Air Force Academy curriculum that recommended cadets avoided gendered language like mom and dad. A United States Marine Corps report that was studying whether we should use sir and ma'am for our drill instructors. A memo from the Department of Defense Secretary Austin recognizing transgender and gender nonconforming persons. The Naval Academy admiral that told midshipmen to read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. $91,000 for diversity and inclusion seminars for the Air Force Band. $180,000 salary for a senior diversity official at the Air Force, which is more than a member of Congress gets paid. And how about Kalissa Wing, who serves as the Department of Defense Education Activities Diversity Chief? 2020 tweet, I'm so exhausted at these white folks in these PD, professional development sessions. This lady actually had the caudacity to say black people can be racist too. I had to stop the session and give Karen the business. We are not the majority. We don't have the power. Are these the priorities of the current administration, to fund the kinds of offices that hire individuals that use this kind of divisive racist language? Is that the priorities of this president's budget? And you have criticized our plan, some conservatives in Congress plan to shrink Washington and grow America. The House Freedom Caucus plan wouldn't reduce the deficit by 1 penny. Which is it? All I've heard today from my Democratic colleagues is all the horrifying cuts that are going to occur. Which is it? Because you're going to say that we're not going to reduce the deficit when you say that we're going to stop a student loan bailout of $400 billion. You're telling me that wouldn't reduce the FY 2023 deficit, to eliminate a $400 billion bailout of student loans. That it wouldn't reduce the deficit if we were to reclaim $91 billion of unspent COVID money, or $80 billion from the IRS expansion, or $78 billion from the so-called Inflation Reduction Act's unspent climate funds, or $270 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act's so-called energy subsidies, or getting Americans back to work under SNAP or Medicaid. All of this that we proposed in the House Freedom Caucus budget would save $4.82 trillion over 10 years.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
And Mr. Chair, since there was obviously a lot there for the last 3 or 4 minutes, I would ask the indulgence if the OMB director could actually respond to some of that if she wishes. I would ask that. I think that would be appropriate.
Yes, we'll give just a few seconds to do what you can on that, Director Young.
Just a few seconds. There are spending cuts you have outlined that we've talked a lot about here today. However, if you continue the tax cuts, which has also been a stated policy goal, of those making over $400,000 and skewed to the wealthy, you use all of those savings for extending those tax cuts. That is where the analysis came from.
And where in the Freedom Caucus proposal that was put out publicly was there any mention of the tax cuts? Putting aside the debate over tax cuts, which is a meritorious debate, but there was no mention of that. So how can then the gentlelady say, oh, this is...
Time has expired on this.
Time was extended, the question was laid out, and the allegation was made that it was about taxes, which is not
Certainly
true.
appreciate the vigor of the conversation with that. Next, we will call on Ms. Balint from Vermont. The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director Young, for being here. As I'm sure you know, this week the Republican majority is bringing a bill to the floor that would put a very large burden on schools and families. It would condition federal funding for schools on implementing policies that will actively harm LGBTQ students. And we're only in DC for a few days this week, and we're spending our valuable time on a bill that would insert the federal government between parents and kids and local schools. It promotes censorship, it promotes book banning, it violates the privacy of young people, and they say it's about freedom, and they say it's about protecting kids. And I have to ask, what about book banning is about protecting freedom, and what about defunding schools is about protecting kids? And I can tell you, this is not how my constituents want me to be spending my time. I was back in Vermont last week, traveling around the state, and we talked about a lot of urgent issues facing families in Vermont: housing, mental health, protecting social safety nets like Social Security and Medicare. We talked about how we have to do more right now to support mental health in schools. And not one person, not one, in all of my travels around the state advocated for less funding for schools. I met with so many high school students last week, and what they told me clearly and directly is that they need us to support them in meaningful ways, especially when it comes to mental health supports. And American families across this country are facing these urgent problems. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention just released their Youth Risk Behavior Survey results, and the results show that teen girls and LGBTQ teens are experiencing extremely high rates of mental distress, violence, and substance abuse. 3 in 5 girls feel persistently sad and hopeless, which is a marker for depressive symptoms, and more than 1 in 4 girls report that they had seriously considered suicide in 2021, 1 in 4. This is a substantial increase from 2011. And we have House Republican leadership ignoring this epidemic and instead pushing H.R. 5, a bill that stokes the fire of division instead of uniting us around this issue that I know that Republicans across the aisle also care about the mental struggles of families in their community. So I want to know why we're not talking about that more. Our kids and teens are suffering. We need real investments in mental health care. And as a parent of school-aged children, I can tell you that is what parents are talking about right now. That's what they're talking about. So I know that Mr. Trone asked about mental health supports. I wonder if you could go back to the president's budget and talk a little bit more about what families and students can look for that will give them hope in this budget around these issues. Thank you.
So that sobering reflection makes me want to put my 16-month-old in a bubble because this is a hard time for young people with social media, and I think many of us who grew up after it wonder how we would have done during this time. And I take this very seriously, and I hope there's bipartisan support to grow the Title I budget, which says it should not matter what zip code you live in, you should have access to a good education in this country. That's an economic argument as well, in addition to just a compassionate one. We also have increases for IDEA, which has been bipartisan in nature. And we have a proposal I hope we take seriously on pre-K 3 and 4, getting kids educated in the system earlier. we think is critical. It's economics. You want more people in the labor force, let's educate them. And it shouldn't matter what zip code, they should have a basic education at a certain level. So that's what this budget does. And I hope we can come together and find some common solutions to, in many ways, what you laid out, a crisis for our kids at that age.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. I will next yield myself 5 minutes. Director Young, thank you for being with us today. A couple of things. First of all, I want to, I have a graph in front of me that I would, without objection, would like entered into the record, and we will get a copy for this. But it shows the timeline of the actual passage of the American Rescue Plan and inflation. At its passage, just before it, inflation was right about 2%. The Congressional Budget Office basically estimated the pre-American Rescue Plan that inflation would peak somewhere just south of 3% and level out around 2%. And actually what we know has happened is that it went above 9% and is now back down just below 7%. It's still insanely high. But just to show this, that the amount of money that was pushed into the system has clearly driven the line, has clearly driven inflation to a 40-year high. Quick question for you. When you started early on, I think you were talking about the energy component, and you said that American oil companies had $200 billion in profit. Is that the number that you?
2022, yes, sir.
In 2022, okay, thank you. So, also without objection, I'd like to enter an article into the record that basically shows that in 2022, Aramco, Saudi Arabia's largest state-owned oil production company, itself had $161 billion in profit, okay? So if I go back and look at this and I think about it, if American oil companies and those producers here in the U.S. are doing very well, and my gas price at the pump was about half and my diesel fuel cost at the farm was about half of what it was, I am much more in favor of those U.S. companies participating in that than I am Saudi Arabia. And so it just seems that the administration's policies are still generating, I mean, the world is still going to use fossil fuels. It's just, are we going to reward our friends in Saudi Arabia, or are we going to reward American workers working in American energy? You know, I go back to the day the president took office and he killed the Keystone Pipeline. And I'm just wondering if any of those communities have seen any of the green energy jobs that were promised. Okay? Not saying jobs aren't created somewhere in America, but when this place makes a decision to gut part of an industry and then leaves a community broken, and the response is, you're gonna be okay, we're just gonna give you a check. I think that's pretty cruel. I think it's pretty inhumane. I think these energy policies are misguided. And the fact that Saudi Arabia's state-owned oil company had $161 billion in profit, a record, I think I'd be looking more at that and how do we drive those revenues back to the U.S. than oppose American innovation, American clean energy, and American energy workers. I want to go back to also a conversation that we were having about the labor participation rate. And that labor participation rate is made up of people that are working part-time, full-time, seeking work, and it's low right now. And I believe that my friend from Wisconsin asked you, Mr. Grothman, about did the labor participation rate include those workers that were part-time or that would only come in and work 2 or 3 days a week? I am sure that there are people that have complicated issues with their household finances. But the reality is, and at least in parts, a big part of the 3rd District of Georgia, we've got a lot of people that will only come in and work 2 days a week, 3 days a week, whatever it is, because they simply do not want to lose those federal benefits. And it seems to me, and it's a reality. I've got my small business owners that are telling me this. And so I just don't understand how this administration can lessen work requirements for people to receive federal benefits. And let me just say this too, when you've got so much in the way of they do so much in the way of SNAP payments and food stamp payments, EBT. Those numbers are so great. This story is told time and time and time again in my district, where someone, they buy all the groceries for the month, and then they turn around and sell the excess dollars for pennies on the dollar just to get cash. I mean, those kind of programs don't make sense. And I don't care how else you say it, it's a disincentive to work. So will the administration work with us to implement incentives for work that actually get people back into the business community to raise that labor participation rate?
Congressman, we share the goal of increasing labor participation. We have differences on how we get there. I'll point to one proposal we have that I think it tells the story. Childcare in this country. Women fell out of the labor market during the pandemic at higher levels than men did. And one reason they have told us that happened is because they don't have adequate child care for their families. We think that proposal is a good economic engine to make sure our labor participation rate goes up.
Reclaiming my time, that sounds well and good, except you're driving the labor needed for childcare out of the market by some of the disincentives. I appreciate your response. We have to agree to disagree on that. And with that, my time has expired. And now I will call on the ranking member of Ed and Workforce, Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, you're now recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Director Young, thank you for being with us today. My staff was told that we couldn't use charts. So I can't present the chart, but if I could, I'd present a chart that would show that every Democratic administration since Kennedy has left office with a better deficit situation than they inherited, and that every Republican administration since Nixon left office with a worse deficit situation than they inherited. And so it's not both sides. And in fact, I understand what portion of today's debt was created by the Trump administration?
I'll say more than 80% of debt was accumulated prior to this administration.
Okay, and the Trump administration, about 25% of the total debt?
Correct, and I just have to point out, Mr. Chairman, $2 trillion in tax cuts does add to the deficit.
Okay, and in fact, in the first 2 years, the Biden administration reduced the deficit 1.7 trillion. And this budget reduces the deficit over 10 years by $3 trillion. Is that in addition to the 1.7?
It is. The budget says if none of his policies are enacted, the deficit would be $2.9 trillion higher than if the president's policies were adopted.
Now, you were badgered about how a slightly higher deficit could be a reduction. Your reduction is if you'd done nothing.
If you'd done nothing.
Compared to doing nothing, your budget deficit would be about $3 trillion less than what it would have been. You are also badgered about a 15% tax and whether that's good for America or not good for America. Can you say why corporations would be more likely to move back to the United States with that tax than move out of offshore?
We've seen corporations leave this country and go to countries where they have effectively no tax rate. We believe, and Secretary Yellen has worked with her partners across the globe, that establishing this minimum global tax will bring companies back to the United States because those tax shelters will no longer be available to them.
Thank you. You've also been badgered about evidence that welfare reduces jobs. Are you aware of the studies that show that if you give a little bit of support to those who are unemployed today, they're actually more likely to get a job than if you don't supply that little support?
That and as they see jobs continue to be added, as they see unemployment remain low, those who have stayed out of the labor market for a long time, we start to see them return into the labor market.
And that has nothing to do with whether or not they get little minimum benefits that may be available?
It does not. I'll point out unemployment insurance may make up half of a person's salary.
And in fact, when some states eliminated the unemployment benefit, under the American Rescue Plan, the additional $600, when some states eliminated that, were those citizens more likely to go back to work than those states that continued the $600?
So we now have data. Those states who chose to turn off those benefits saw no more of a boost to their labor participation or unemployment rates than those that kept the enhanced benefits.
And in fact, they saw less economic activity because those people with unemployment benefits are more likely to spend every dime they got. That goes right back in the economy and stimulates the economy. Does your budget protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid?
Congressman, Social Security and Medicaid, this budget ensures that no benefits would be cut. In Medicaid, we would actually add benefits, for example, for women to make sure they'd have 12 months of postpartum coverage. We've seen terrible, terrible statistics out of COVID that pregnant women are seeing a 40% increase in deaths. So we're doing more in that space. And in Medicare, we've talked about a lot. We would extend the solvency by at least 25 years.
And Social Security?
Social Security, this budget maintains the president's ironclad commitment that he will not reduce benefits.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Next, a colleague from Utah, Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore, you're recognized.
Thank you, Representative Ferguson. I want to echo the chairman's comments earlier, and sharing appreciation for you to reach out to us earlier. We had a conversation, and want to continue to keep that dialogue going. We have major fiscal issues in our nation, and I hope everybody on this committee, truly recognizes that. And I want to just lay out the three big things that we need to be doing. And I really tried to dig into these three things. And if we can do this, we can actually get ourselves to some sense of fiscal sanity. And again, Republicans and Democrats are going to probably disagree on a little bit of the how, but if we can at least agree on the three major things. The first thing is to find wasteful spending, right? That is, to my opinion, the lowest hanging fruit in all of budgetary considerations, is to find wasteful spending. I'll dig into a little bit more of this, but it's been the large focus of my colleagues and I know Chairman Arrington's drive is to scour the budget, scour what we've done over the last 2 to 3 years, and find areas of just waste that we can easily claw back and find ways for improvement. And everything has to be on the table, right? So in 2019, and I'm going to use OMB numbers, so please correct me if I have any of this incorrect, but our total revenues in 2019 were $3.5 trillion. Our total expenditures, so our total budget was $4.4 trillion. And what's projected right now for 2024, total revenues at $4.8 trillion. That is $1.3 trillion more than just 2019. But our expenses, our total budget is $6.4 trillion. We're talking 2024. That's an increase of $2 trillion. From 2019 to 2024, there is a delta of $2 trillion in our total budget. Things haven't fundamentally changed that much in our nation over the last 5 years. When you had the pandemic, costs went up. There was a bipartisan approach to that. Then there was the American Rescue Plan, right? I firmly disagree with the American Rescue Plan. Democrats will even say that it ties to inflation. Okay, let's figure out a way to address that. It happened. Wish it didn't happen, but it happened, and we need to come back at it. We have an opportunity to find waste in our budgeting. Number two is the participation rate. The area that I'm really passionate about, and it's something that Utah always has a really good approach to, is finding ways to lift people out of poverty. If you're born in the lower 20% of socioeconomic numbers, status, you have the best opportunity in Utah to get into the top 20%. It's probably the thing I'm most proud about from being from my state. And it's because we incentivize work. We show the dignity of work is what builds lives. And we're not seeing that right now with what President Biden is doing. If we're going to brag about going from the highest unemployment, from 10 plus to maybe 14 unemployment just a few years ago, right at the height of the pandemic, and then brag about being at 3.5, but having more still enrolled in welfare programs, we've got a problem here. Because if unemployment's going down, then the same should be true with what we're needing from our assistance. And there has to be a fix there, and so is participation rate. And again, we're doing a hearing on it later, won't dig into it, but healthcare costs, right? So we've got to truly find a way to make healthcare affordable and not just cap it here and make someone else pay for it and we're just financing who pays for it right now, and truly go after these issues. Finding waste, increasing participation rate, and get after healthcare in a really true, sincere way. I'm gonna give you an opportunity. What areas are we finding that you're truly finding be able to cut waste? Like, families have to do this all the time. What is the federal government doing right now to truly target and cut waste? Anything in this budget that's clear? Because the numbers are going up, so we're obviously not decreasing the numbers.
So thank you, and you're right. We agree, I don't disagree with anything you've said. Where we have disagreement on what we consider wasteful, how you get people back into the labor market. So we do have disagreements there. I will point out something I pointed out earlier on that we have a choice about. We close loopholes, for example, oil and gas companies. That loophole closure saves $31 billion. The choice is, would you rather do that? Or would you rather cut some of these programs we've spent a lot of time talking about and non-defense discretionary? We save $160 billion for the taxpayers by negotiating drug prices, more of them and quicker than we did in the IRA in the budget.
Thank you.
We believe that that is also a place we should target for savings and pay pharma less money.
Thank you.
So we do have a difference.
I'll have to reclaim because I'm actually over time now. But I just want to end, this is the highlight. We are saying we agree on the overall principle and where we're going, and it's the how about where we get there. I would just encourage us to look at the success we've had. Our revenues are up. They're at historic highs. You can't not look at Tax Cut and Jobs Act and not say that contributed. We keep companies here. We keep them competitive globally. We grow our revenue. We have to find areas of waste and getting people back to work. Thank you, Director.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Again, for the record, the article that I mentioned was from CNBC, a Saudi oil giant, Aramco, post record $161 billion profit for 2022. This would be submitted to the record without objection. Next, I'll call on my colleague and friend from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee, you are recognized.
I don't think it's not on. You have to talk about it. Might be to the right.
Yep, it's under all that.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Director, can we look at each other? I know that I don't have a direct line here of being able to see. We appreciate the work that is going on in this room. Let me thank the chairman and the ranking member for the time allotted, and thank the director for the leadership of the Biden administration for a timely submission of a budget. Just a question, have you gotten a budget from Speaker McCarthy, from the majority in the House?
You may remember I said I worked here for a long time, and I will say budgets are congressional documents, so we would not be in receipt of that, but there are various proposals floating around. I don't think they're.
But you have not seen a final floating around budget at this time?
I have not.
Thank you. Let me get you focused back on this deficit, and I'm very delighted, and I have to go quickly. I see that the budget lowers the deficit by $3 trillion. Just a quick response. The deficit could be increasing, but what is the value of the fact that this budget puts it down $3 trillion? Because from my perspective, there is movement and recognition that we continually, as the deficit grows, we're still building to take it down. So please explain that.
So look, the $2.9 trillion, nearly $3 trillion, is a reflection of nothing changed, no policies were enacted. The deficit would be almost $3 trillion higher than the president's policies he's put forward.
And could you explain the value of making the child tax credit permanent for families in America, working and middle-class families in America?
Look, it's one of the few programs we get to say we beta tested in 2021. We saw the results for American families, for children who were lifted out of poverty. And this president believes that that was a good statistic. And we've seen those poverty levels go back up, which means that the child tax credit worked. And we'd like to see it continue.
And the most, maybe as large as housing, childcare, where your budget provides a vital infusion of dollars for childcare for working families. How does it see that being an economic engine booster?
I talked about it a little earlier. We saw women drop out of the labor market during the pandemic at high levels. Thankfully, we're seeing the return. But if we want to increase labor market participation for people with young children, child care is often an economic burden for those families, and we'd like to do something about that.
Let me follow up with the issue of housing. 30% of a family's income or more. Do you plus up housing opportunities or housing products to encourage, even with the lack of supply, how does the budget respond to that need?
So we continue to support vouchers, because in some parts of the country where there is housing supply, vouchers are still needed for families. But we recognize that many parts of the country, in your districts, housing supply is tight, and some places at crisis level. So we have a suite of proposals, mainly through tax credits, that would promote the building of affordable housing.
Let me do a round robin. I'm looking at a proposed Freedom Caucus budget that wants to go back to 2019 levels, and I'm seeing the slashing of veterans' health care, education, healthcare programs gutted, $29 billion, the funding of law enforcement and disaster response. What does 2019 levels really mean? The country is growing. We have to respond to that. We are the United States, not an individual state. How do you respond to that?
Look, cutting means you do less. And the discussion will be what is tolerable and what doesn't impact the economy negatively. This president certainly does not agree that he'd like to see fewer FBI personnel, and that would mean that. It would mean fewer law enforcement grants, meaning fewer cops in our communities, and fewer Pell Grants. The list goes on. Opioid crisis we talked about earlier. We can send less state grants to governors to battle that, and on many nutrition programs.
I'll move to the next question very quickly. It is important to have civil rights for all Americans. For some reason, people think civil rights is a race-based determination. My school district, the Houston Independent School District, is being taken over unfairly by the state of Texas. Civil rights is important for those children. How are you funding civil rights? And I believe it's not woke agenda, it is being awake. How are you funding the civil rights entities in the various agencies that respond to Americans who feel that their civil rights have been violated?
So, there's the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, I think most people are aware of. This budget would seek an increase for that and ensure that we make sure people, states, are following the law when it comes to civil rights in this country.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I thank my friend from Texas.
I was just going on. Thank you very much.
You
Mr.
bet, no
Chairman.
problem.
I thank the director very much for her leadership.
You bet. Now, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to my friend from California, David Valadeo.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Director Young, for your time today. Really appreciate you testifying in front of the Budget Committee today. I want to talk about two issues that really hit close to home for my constituents. First, energy prices, and second, water, and how the President plans to address these issues in the fiscal year 2024 budget. The President has called on domestic oil and gas industry to produce more energy, but the President's fiscal year 24 budget removes tax deductions on small independent oil and natural gas producers. These producers account for over 90% of the wells in the U.S. and produce over 80% of America's oil and 90% of America's natural gas. These local producers are ramping up production to meet our pressing energy needs, while creating high-paying jobs and generating critical revenue that support our local public services in California's Central Valley. The President's budget proposes to end some of the tax deductions that many of these independent producers use to maintain depleted wells and invest in exploration for oil and gas. These are no different from standard deductions a business takes for the depreciating value or of equipment or investments in research and development. Do you think it's contradictory for President Biden to call on oil and gas companies to increase production while at the same time his budget eliminates the tax deductions and burdens domestic energy producers with significant tax increases?
Congressman, I'll point out that domestic production is about 1 million barrels per day greater than it was in January 2021. So we continue to see robust energy production in this country. And as you know, the debate about what loopholes to close, what taxes, is countered with what spending to cut. So we have a choice if we want to get our long-term fiscal house in order.
So what policies is in the president's budget will encourage oil and gas exploration and spur investment in increased supply?
I'll just point out again, we see over 1 million barrels a day more than when the president took office. We see refinery up more than 28% than 2 years ago. So his policies are not getting in the way of production. We're seeing increased production and refinery.
We're actually seeing a decrease in production in the Central Valley. We're not seeing as much investment. We've seen it to the point where local communities have actually had to increase sales tax to make up for the difference in losses in revenues because of the number of jobs that were created, the number of investments that were made, the amount of equipment was purchased, the amount of even local revenue to the local businesses, to the point where they've actually had to raise revenue through sales tax to make up for the losses because of the lack of permitting approved of. And some of that is state and some of that's federal. Sadly, we're fighting it from both sides in California. And I know that the tax credits are something that the administration doesn't support, but in the previous comments from my colleague from Texas, tax credits were mentioned as one of the ways that you would increase housing by giving tax credits to people to build more. And I would say the same thing would work for oil. And if you take away those tax credits, you're going to have the opposite effect of what you're going to do for housing. Now on to water. My district in the Central Valley is one of the many across western U.S. that has struggled with severe drought in recent years. While the last few months have brought much needed rainfall to our state, we do not have enough water storage to capture and store this critical resource. Drought will be back before we know it, and the people in my community will once again be asking why we couldn't hold on to more of the rain we've seen in the recent months. And the reason I bring this up is Sites Reservoir is a reservoir in Northern California that we've been talking about in California for 60 years, so longer than my life, obviously, and a lot of people in this room, and we can't get those permits approved. Lake Success, a reservoir not far from me that is overflowing as we speak because of all this rainfall, it took 30 years. I was probably still in high school when they started talking about this, just for them to be able to expand an existing reservoir 10 feet to be able to hold some of this water. And so when we look at the situation where I've now got neighbors sending me pictures as they're evacuating their houses, they're evacuating their farms. One neighbor only a mile from my house, a couple miles from my house, is actually moving his cows off of his farm as we speak. And so we're losing all this water out into the ocean. We're losing it into people's farms, people's homes. We're not able to capture this water because of the permitting. This administration is something, and I know this isn't directly under OMB, but it is something that needs to be addressed, and I would hope that the president understand the value of that water that we're wasting today, because that would help us create jobs for years to come, because we would be able to farm ground instead of the situation where we had over the last year or two where we weren't able to farm a lot of our ground because of the lack of water. So what policies in the president's budget support water storage, and what is the administration doing to ensure regulatory red tape is removed so that these critical storage projects can be constructed as soon as possible?
So I spoke about this earlier, and I know we're short on time, but one, I think there is room here in a bipartisan way to work on permitting. Both sides have plans. Both sides have said they want to do something about it. We have to sit down and do something about it. OMB has a small piece of guidance we put out to try to help streamline, but it's going to take congressional action to do something further, and you've heard the president talk about this, so I hope the room opens to be able to have fulsome conversations that result in changes there. We do, with bill resources, bipartisan infrastructure law, put some funding in the West towards drought. And we are not taking it for granted that the rain will not continue forever. and we've got to find long-term solutions. Water Smart is one of the things we're doing, but we know it's too little, and we've got to figure out something. 40 million people, I know more than half, are in California who are dealing with the Colorado River situation alone. So you have my commitment to work on long-term drought solutions in the West.
Just one thing to note, in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, one of the reasons why I was very much in opposition to it was because it specifically was drafted in a way that would prevent one of our most affordable projects from being expanded, which is Shasta Reservoir. And why they would do that in a piece of legislation. I mean, if you're looking to save money and invest, that would be one way. And in California, it's always interesting. If they want to build high-speed rail or they want to build a football stadium in LA or San Francisco, environmental regulations almost don't even exist to them. But we talk about a reservoir for 60 years and can't break ground on it.
The gentleman's time has
So,
expired.
thank you, and I yield
Very
back.
important issue for the West and the Southwest, and I appreciate the dialogue and the openness to bipartisan solutions. With that, I'd like to yield to Ms. Wexton from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Director Young, it's wonderful to see you again. Thank you so much for coming back to join us today. Before I start with my questions, I do want to comment a little bit about the comments of the gentleman from Utah about waste, fraud, and abuse, the three sisters. I agree that we need to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, and especially waste. But the issue that we're seeing with waste is that one person's waste is another person's valuable program. And for me, it really was driven home to me when we saw the littoral ships, what happened with them in the 2022 debate over the NDAA. Now, the Navy had wanted to discontinue this program. They asked that the littoral ship program be discontinued, but it was a pet project of one of the very powerful members of the Appropriations Committee. So then, oddly enough, it ended up back in there, right? Even though the Navy didn't want it. So they thought it was wasteful, but this one member and her allies thought it was also very useful for her district. So it remained in there. So that's a good example of waste not being waste in the eyes of all. And I believe that some of the issues that are priorities in this budget, things like cutting childhood poverty in half, like helping women reenter the workforce and increase the slots available for high-quality daycare and high-quality childcare slots, and also high-quality preschool. The increasing availability of affordable workforce housing, and encouraging the production of clean and renewable energy. These are important things that I don't view as wasteful at all. So I just want to thank the President and you for getting this great budget to us. I would ask a question. I would just want to thank you for a couple of things that you've included in this year's budget. At the risk of sounding like a broken record from our conversation last year, as you're aware, I have a lot of federal workers in my district here, just at Northern Virginia. I do want to thank you. Every year I turn right to the employee compensation part of the budget. I was pleased to see that President Biden included a large pay increase for both civilian and federal workers and military service members for 2024, and I hope that we can get to that 8.7% number. Can you talk about how the pay increase will help federal employees and their families in today's economy, as well as how it will boost retention and recruitment efforts at federal agencies?
Congresswoman, I know your constituents thank you for your continued hard work on these issues. I've heard from you many times in amplification of the work that they've done, many of them who toil without a lot of thanks. They do it for the mission, certainly not for the money. I'd like to point out the 5.2% for military and civilians is based on a statutory formula. And the President went with that formula because of the recognition of the disparity between private sector and public sector has just grown. I'm not sure 5.2% closes that much, but it's a first step to accept the recommendations of that formula, and also in recognition of the hard work federal workers do. Many of them throughout the pandemic worked in our veterans hospitals, on the border, and all of them, including the men and women at my agency, just worked hours beyond regular hours to make sure that all of their agencies' talent was brought to bear during this pandemic.
Thank you, Director Young. I was also really happy to see that the budget request includes $1.4 billion in compensation for TSA employees. For too long, they've been undercompensated given the work that they do. I want to thank you for building on the raise that we included in the FY23 omnibus. Thank you for that. Also, Virginia's 10th congressional district is home to just about every kind of air traffic control that there is, including we have 3 airports, 2 regional and 1 international airport with Dulles Airport. We have a lot of air traffic controllers there. We have the Leesburg Air Traffic Control Center in Leesburg, which does basically all the air traffic for the East Coast. We've got Potomac Tracon in Fauquier County in Warrenton. And so we have a whole lot of air traffic controllers work in this district. What would happen what would the impact of a 22% budget cut to the FAA be on air traffic control and the safety of our nation's airspace?
I mean,
Not to mention what has happened with bringing back all the air travel. What would happen then?
So one, I think all can agree they've seen that our air system must be modernized in this country. We've taken far too long to do that. This budget would put resources to do that. If we went backwards, we do less. And one analysis shows that air traffic control would be one of those things. They are in non-defense discretionary. And our analysis shows that 125 air traffic control towers would be shut.
How many air traffic control towers?
125.
Okay, that's a whole lot of air traffic control that wouldn't be happening. Very good. And as far as transportation and safety upgrades, we've seen a number of high-profile accidents and near misses in our national rail and aviation system so far this year. And we've also seen an uptick in pedestrian and cyclist injuries and deaths caused by drivers in the past few years. I look forward to discussing these topics with Secretary Buttigieg and Ambassador Nolan in our appropriations hearing next month. Thank you very much. I see my time has expired.
I thank the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Wexton, and now yield and recognize my friend from, also my friend from Michigan, Ms.
You had to look
Ms.
up and down the
McLean.
aisle for
Don't
me.
know why I was looking for Fishbach, but Ms. McLean from Michigan. I yield 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Young, for being here. I want to talk a little bit to get our arms around the statement that you talked about at the very beginning, right? And it's asking the wealthy and the corporations to begin paying their fair share. I realize that we have a progressive tax system in the United States, but I just want to start with some facts from the IRS, not right-wing sources, but the IRS. So in 2020, the IRS reported that the top 1% paid 42% of all the federal income taxes. The top 10% paid almost 74%. So 10% paying 74% of all the total income taxes, right? Again, this is information from the IRS. I'm trying to wrap my arms around what is the number that the wealthy and the corporations would have to pay for you in this administration to feel like they paid their fair share? Is it, and I'm asking for a numeric number, is it 78, 92, 104?
Just like I answered your former colleague, the gross number is not in my view, the appropriate way to look at these metrics. We look at these metrics as a percentage of GDP, for example. And as I pointed out, when we had surpluses in the mid-90s, we were at about 19.6% of revenue.
With all due respect, you're a very intelligent woman. You've done really good work. It's a great answer to a question that I didn't ask. It's not a tough question. It's not a simple question. It's not a difficult question. It's a direct question. In order to pick, right now, we have the top 10% of the wealthy and corporations. And let's not forget, it's the economic system that give us our social programs, right? We don't want the producers to stop producing because then who's going to pay? I don't have a money tree in my backyard that I can just go out and take money. I realize I come from the business sector, and business could never operate the way government does because we'd be out of business. So with that said, I'm just looking for a really simple number. Do you want the wealthy and the corporations to pay 82%? It's not a got ya. It's in what's the right number?
Well, you asked me my opinion, and I told you that is not how we analyze what policies go here. Let me point out one thing. The idea, one, that those making less than $400,000 pay less into the system.
Let's stick with the topic, though. And
Sure.
please, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful, I'm trying to get to a number because it seems like you're evading the number. 10% of the people pay 74% of the taxes. Is it 78? Would that make you feel comfortable?
What are those 10% worth compared to the 90% of other Americans?
Well,
What-
90% of
what
the other
what is their
Americans
wealth
pay
compared to the
24% of the
90%?
taxes. So should only the top 10% pay the taxes and we raise that number so only the top 10 pay the taxes? I mean, we have a progressive tax system. It's a numerical number. Why are you avoiding it?
To me, the question is, and this is how we analyze what policies to put, what are the top 10% worth in this country? And what percentage of their income are they paying into taxes? What we have found.
And last I checked, we do have a progressive tax rate, correct?
And what we have found.
Is that correct?
Is that billionaires, some of the wealthiest families, 400 of the wealthiest families, pay about an 8% effective tax rate.
And you know what?
That's less than most middle class
We're talking about
families.
400 families. I'm with you on that.
Of the top
right.
bracket.
1.5 million tax returns are put into the IRS system for the top 1%. We're talking about 400. I'm talking about the other 99%, which you don't want to talk about. So it's a real simple question, and I don't understand why we're dodging it. I agree with you with the 4. Is it 82%? I mean, why is it so difficult to give an answer?
I just think
It is
that
because you
not
haven't
how
been
we-
able to give us an
Well,
answer.
it's the president's budget, and I'm trying to tell you how we approach these things. I am
So
worried
it's the
about.
bottom line that counts, provided you know how to
I am
count.
worried
If we
about
can
the
just do a shell
90%
game.
versus the 10% who have more income than the rest of the 90%, and they pay an effective less tax rate
And I
than
would
most
say
teachers and
this
nurses in this
is, you're
country.
talking about 400 people out of 100, or
What are they
1.5 million.
But what are they worth
And
compared
what
to
are
the
they
rest of the country?
paying? Those top 10% are paying 74% of what we
8%
bring,
of what-
of what we bring in.
8%
We
of their
should be
income.
celebrating those people.
8% of their income, which we think is
And again,
unfair.
this is the problem with the American people. We refuse to answer the question. We only want to frame the issue on how we want to frame it. So again, my disappointment is that, again, we have a very intelligent person and we can't get an answer. We can't get a
The
numerical
gentlelady's time has
Thank you.
expired.
Thank you, and I yield
thank
back.
the gentlelady from Michigan, and now recognize Mr. Yakum from Indiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to Ranking Member Boyle on your appointment. And thank you to Director Young for being here today. Inflation is the single biggest issue I hear from my constituents as I travel the 11 counties within my district. Seniors can't keep up with the price of food. Farmers, many of whom from my district are here with me today, can't keep up with skyrocketing input costs. And the same is true for small businesses. Families feel the pain at the grocery store and at the pump. Local governments can't get vital infrastructure projects done because of the skyrocketing costs. These are the stories I hear from real people as I travel the district. It's generally accepted in economics, on the economics community, that there are two main ways to lower inflation, and that's to reduce federal spending or raise interest rates. And we saw that just yesterday, the Federal Reserve is taking their foot off the gas as it relates to interest rate hikes. And so what about the spending equation from our federal government? Well, as I see the president's budget, it doubles down on policies that supercharge this generational inflation. It's a fiscally irresponsible economic disaster. And that stands in stark contrast with your written testimony, which speaks of the president's, quote, commitment to fiscal responsibility. Because this budget spends $1.8 trillion in terms of a deficit that we don't have next year, which is larger than fiscal year 2023. It also calls for $82 trillion of spending over the next 10 years, which adds $17 trillion to our debt on top of the $31 trillion that we already have. And from my vantage point, as a father of our oldest child that's 13, 10 years from now, she'll be graduating college and looking for her first job, and I don't believe it's responsible to hand her $51 trillion of national debt. And that doesn't even include some of the budget-busting gimmicks, like temporarily expanding the child tax credit for 3 years at a cost of $470 billion, which hides the true cost over 10 years, which is likely to be closer to $1.5 trillion. We need to seriously evaluate out-of-control government spending and the negative implications it has on everyday Americans. We've heard from Democrats many times over the course of the last 3 months about the debt ceiling and the debt limit. and the fiscal irresponsibility that it would be to not increase the debt limit this summer. But I also think about, and I would be curious as to your thoughts about the debt and the spending crisis and the consequences over the course of the next 10 years by adding, as the president's budget calls for, an additional $17 trillion to our national debt.
Congressman, thank you for that. I'll point out that CBO has given you a baseline, and it states what will happen to our debt and deficits if nothing else happens. What the president's budget does is lay out a set of proposals. I've heard lots of disagreement on those proposals. That's fair, but he does lay out a set of proposals, many of them targeting those that make over $400,000 and billionaires and hundreds of millionaires. So his investments are paid for. I get the disagreement, but it would be fiscally irresponsible had he not put a proposal to pay for his investments and put some of those savings to deficit reduction.
And you're correct, the CBO does lay out a baseline. But I think for us as government leaders, both in the Congress and with the president, it's our responsibility to figure out how we restore fiscal responsibility to our nation's fiscal state. Do you believe that with the president's budget of $17 trillion of additional deficit spending, which again takes us to $50 trillion of total debt in 10 years, do you believe that that is the definition of a commitment to fiscal responsibility, $50 trillion of national debt?
I feel very strongly, and it is a fact, that this president's policies, whether you agree with them or not, will bring down the deficit over a 10-year period by more than $3 trillion compared to if we did nothing. So this president is doing something, and I get the disagreements, but he is putting forth proposals that would bring down the deficit by $3 trillion through tax reform.
Comparing doing nothing is like comparing ourselves to the worst team in football. I don't think we need to compare ourselves to doing nothing. I think what we need to compare ourselves to is what does success look like ultimately? And I don't believe that it's $17 trillion in debt. Do you believe that the American Rescue Plan reduced or increased inflation?
Congressman, for your last comment, I'll just point out that the president's budget is the only thing out there. So we are comparing ourselves to if we did nothing. So I look forward to seeing other proposals, but this is the president's plan. This is the thing before us. Do I believe inflation was due to the ARP? I think was the last.
Do you believe the ARP increased or decreased inflation?
I believe, and this is, I know you won't like the answer, that we see inflation across the globe. The ARP was not passed in France or the UK or the Netherlands, and they see persistent inflation.
But do you believe that
not
the
as
ARP
bad as the
increased or
United States.
reduced inflation in the United States?
Look, this president's been clear. Prices are too high. That is why we have proposals that deal with costs for American people in this budget.
So again, so the
Childcare,
ARP
energy.
increased or reduced inflation? I just wanted an answer. Did it increase or reduce inflation from your
I'm
estimate?
sure it had some impact on inflation, and as the acting chair at the time pointed out, it was passed at a time of lower inflation. However, we believe, given the global climate and global inflation, that coming out of the pandemic, supply chain issues, lack of competition in shipping, for example, certainly had a greater role because all major economies are seeing inflation.
Right. I thank you for your time today. I thank you for the call that we had earlier
Thank
this
you
week
so
as well. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Now would like to recognize for 5 minutes my friend from Oklahoma, Josh Burkeen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Young, thank you. I'm at the tail end, so I know you've been through a grueling process. I'm looking at the 22 budget from the president, so just to kind of put this in context, we're talking a couple of years ago, and in noticing that you all have said that you're going to save $3 trillion over the next 10-year window, and the way that you're doing that is you're saying CBO, if we change nothing, gets us to a $20 trillion total debt load by deficit spending within 10 years, which would put our national debt at $50 trillion in 10 years, to go from 30 trillion to 50 trillion. And you're saying that we'll still grow trillions of dollars in our debt, we just won't get to 20 trillion, we'll get to 17 trillion, thus a $3 trillion reduction over the baseline. Is that accurate?
That is one way to say it.
Okay. So in looking at that, we're looking at the 2022 budget from a few years ago, where in the first year change, you all laid out a 10-year window, and you had a $100 billion increase from one year to the next, and then you averaged about $15 billion increase year after year. So what you did was you front-loaded a large increase, and then for the next several years, you averaged 15 billion. The reason why I'm pointing that out is in this budget, there's a very similar tactic that you move from one year to the next of $150 billion, the next year 75 billion, and then you project a 1.7% increase, which is 35 billion over the next 7-8 years. So what you've done is you say we're going to increase a massive amount the first 2 years, but then we're going to slow it to 1.7% growth of government versus the first couple of years. If we average it from 2 years ago, it's been 7%. So my question is this: the greatest predictor of future behavior is past behavior. How is this not a gimmick? And how is this leading to $3 trillion in savings ever going to be realized when your past is going to predict your future? If you've averaged 7% growth in government and you say, hey, we'll get our savings in year 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 by only growing 1.7%, is that not a gimmick?
So I'll point out our $3 trillion in savings are heavily tied to our revenue proposals. Those are not plugs. They are analyzed, scored by career staff at Department of Treasury mostly. The growth in Medicare, Social Security, and other entitlements, we get those estimates from our agencies like the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. So I say that to say, our level of being able to manipulate these things are not high. The vast majority are scored that way. Now, it depends on how we develop our policies. Are some of our policies earlier years implementation? Yes. But that is how we are proposing developing those policies. It's not meant to be a gimmick. It is just our view of how best to implement them. Some are actually the opposite way, where we
Reclaiming
slowly
my
ramp
time.
up. Sure, I'm sorry.
I'm watching the clock, and as a new member trying to figure out how to manage my time here, Mr. Chairman. So I would just say that I'm not saying that other administrations haven't done this. I would just contend if you look at the history and look at the future, then at 7%, it actually, instead of saving $3 trillion, it actually adds $2 trillion more above the baseline. So I just contend, I think it's a great way to get the numbers we want for our purposes of looking like we're saving money, but I contend it's not ever going to be realized, and it's going to be greater than this. Let me ask you this. We know Congressman Norman mentioned $3 billion is going to be added in your budget proposal for gender equity. Climate change mentioned 42 times. LGBTQ mentioned 7 times. You all are taxing on the death tax. You're doubling the death tax for farmers and ranchers. I'm a little small ranch. My family lost a sizable piece of property years ago on my mother's side because of the death tax. You all claim that you're not going to see an increase for those a tax increase for those who make above $400,000. The average rancher farmer, according to USDA, makes $92,000 or less, and that's. So can you guarantee the American people that a doubling of the death tax is not going to be borne by the farmers and ranchers who make, on average, less than $92,000 per year?
This president has an ironclad commitment. Those making under $400,000 will not see more taxes. I think you're talking about our stepped-up basis plan, and certainly those smaller farms are exempt from that. And you have my commitment to work to make sure we do common sense policies, but we've got to do something to make sure that larger corporations, no matter what business they're in, pay more into the system to make sure we can save those small family farms.
Mr. Chair, I just need to say, I contend that the small farmer and rancher will pay it. It will be borne by those who make a small amount of money, who keep assets in their land value. And I just think it's misguided to think the farmer and rancher, the average person making a small amount, is not going to pay this tax.
I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma's time has expired. Now I want to recognize Ms. Schakowsky from Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Dr. Young, it's great to see you. Happy to be back on the Budget Committee. As I know you know, the bipartisan infrastructure law that we passed also included the Building America, the Building America and Buy America Act, which I am so happy is part of that legislation. It requires that all federal financed infrastructure projects use American iron and steel manufactured products, and make sure that we really are buying and building America. As OMB, in your role at OMB, and in really implementing this, I wanted to just say that I think that it is so critical that the federal infrastructure programs maximize the creation of good union jobs at the same time as we're addressing the supply chain and making it clean and more secure. So while I understand that there are some exceptions in the law of Build America, Buy America, I want to make sure that we're implementing that in a targeted way, in a transparent way, and a time-limited way. And so I just wanted to ask you if there's any update on the implementation of the Build America, Buy America, and taking into consideration what I was saying about some exceptions.
If you want to hear the president get excited, talk about Made in America. And I'm happy to say the Made in America office, which was established by the president and made statutory by the bipartisan infrastructure law, so I thank you all for that, is housed in OMB. And for far too long, agencies would just issue waivers with Buy America without real analysis to see what products they could secure from American manufacturers. The president, and I've heard him say it, to his cabinet over and over, not on his watch. And if there are waivers, they better be term limited, and they have to have justification that it would imperil these projects. So we are very much aligned to make sure that we not only take the spirit of Buy America, which has been on the books, I think, 70 years, but actually do it. And you have our commitment to continue to work together, be aggressive here. Let me just give you one example. We worked extensively with the Department of Transportation to develop their plan for domestic content participation for EV chargers. That'll support investments in the supply chain, consistent with an aggressive expansion of domestic manufacturing. Because we all said we wouldn't go down this route of having supply chain shortages if we ever found ourselves in a pandemic or in other complicated situations like we see with the invasion of Ukraine. We need to make more here. We also see the updated rule increase the percentage of value for manufactured products from 55% to 60% this past fall. It'll go up to 65% in 2024 and 75% in 2029. So we welcome the collaboration, happy to take input on where we could do better. We don't want to stall projects, but people need to look for American products. They're out there, and agencies have to take the time to find them when they make sense.
So with just half a minute remaining, what is an example of something that at least right now might have to be an exception?
So if we can't find enough minerals, for example, as we ramp up our battery production in this country, we might have to bring in some content. But the idea is that won't be forever, and that we need to do more here. Because we've seen now what every American now knows what supply chain means. And that was not the case before the pandemic. And we should never find ourselves in that position again.
And it would be limited in time, right?
That is the goal for all of this. As we see our manufacturing boost, almost 800,000 jobs in manufacturing added under this president. So as we see these jobs come back to the U.S., more made in America, the idea is that will create systemic long-term change.
The gentlelady's time has expired. Great conversation, discussion. But let's now move to my Texas colleague, senior physician in the House, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairman and Thank you for your endurance today. I know it's been a long day. You had a conversation with Senator Romney in the Senate hearing, and you implied that we're going to need bipartisan effort to work together to find common ground to save Social Security and protect Medicare. Is that still an operational statement?
Look, you see an old congressional staffer here. All of these things in the president's budget will require Congress to act, so absolutely.
So sometimes it's a little disconcerting that some of the rhetoric that comes out directed at people like myself who have genuinely worked on this problem for a long time, being accused of things that are just simply not true. But I have to ask you, over the last 2 years, where have there been cuts in Medicare over the last 2 years?
Congressman, there have not been cuts from the president, presented in the president's budget, or administratively.
Any doctor in this country that you ask that question will tell you that they have suffered significant reimbursement reductions in the last 2 years, on top of a base inflation rate that is unlike anything that's been seen in 20 years. And that's just simply a fact. So I think we ought to agree that we can work together. No one's hands are completely clean here, but we need to be focused on what can be done for the future. Now, in previous budgets from President Obama and President Trump, they talked about site-neutral policy in payments in Medicare. Site-neutral payment policy being that it didn't matter whether the service was delivered at a doctor's office or a hospital, the reimbursement rate would be the same. And yet, current law is that under the outpatient payment rates, it costs 3 times to do something in a hospital what it costs to do in the doctor's office. But wouldn't you agree that site-neutral policy is something that we should be pursuing?
Congressman, I'm happy to look at those proposals. Clearly, that is not reflected in the president's budget, and yet he has a plan on solvency. So I offer to sit down and talk to you about those, but those are not reflected in the president's budget.
Correct, and that's just, it was curious to me why the 2 previous administrations talked about a site-neutral policy and this administration did not. Look, the fact remains, over the last 2 years, House and Senate Democrats and the administration worked together on mammoth reconciliation bills that didn't include any Republican input, raided money, $300 billion from Medicare to pay for Green New Deal programs. Why was it not a priority to fix these problems that you're now talking about? Why was it not a priority to fix these problems while the Democrats were doing their reconciliation bills in the last 2 years?
Congressman, it is extremely beneficial to the taxpayer and to seniors. The prescription drug benefit seen in the Inflation Reduction Act. We absolutely did address Medicare in a substantial way. Seniors will not only see reduced out-of-pocket costs, but also the taxpayer will, because we will pay less.
Yeah, let me just suffice it to say there's a difference of opinion on that, and there is a difference of opinion on what it does to the downstream effects of innovation. However, those cuts that occurred in the Part B program basically affect physicians' offices, and those dollars saved were basically used to go to pay insurance companies in the Affordable Care Act and increase subsidies of the Silver Plan in the Affordable Care Act. And it is that fundamental unfairness that makes people suspicious of what the administration has in store, what it has in plan when it talks about the future for Medicare and Social Security.
Well, I hope they look at the budget, because we're very clear. It moves the net investment tax to the trust fund. It raises the tax from 3.8% to 5% for those making over $400,000. And that is laid out very clearly for those who are concerned about what our policy is. And those policies will extend the solvency by 25 years at least.
But to look at other policies like a site-neutral policy, perhaps way the purchase of prescription drugs occurs in CMS, there are other programs or there are other approaches that would yield real savings right now, and it seems like the administration is not interested in pursuing those. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Texas and now recognize Mr. Buddy Carter from the great state of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Young, thank you for being here. Appreciate it very much. This is actually the third time that I've had the opportunity to ask you questions since I've been on the Budget Committee, and I'm sure you don't remember, but the first two times I made it clear that I don't agree with the president on his priorities on spending. I understand it, but I certainly, we have our differences on that. But I think that we do agree that we should be protecting Americans and protecting our citizens. And number one responsibility of the federal government is to protect our homeland and protect our citizens. And that's why I'm so concerned about what's going on down at the border, the southern border, the southwest border. You see, I'm a pharmacist, a healthcare professional, and every day we're losing upwards to 300 people every day as a result of drug overdose, much of it fentanyl poisoning, not overdose, poisoning, not addiction. And it concerns me, and listen, I can rattle off the figures with you, and 1.9 billion people, that's enough to kill, and fentanyl in our country, enough to kill 1.9 billion people. It's gotten so bad, if you'll look here, Ms. Young, I actually carry naloxone in my backpack. This will reverse the effects if used quickly enough of fentanyl. And I actually carry it in my backpack everywhere I go. And I believe there are two things that we have to do in order to address this problem with the fentanyl poison in our country. One is that you got to stop the supply. And most of it's coming from the southern border. And secondly, I want to make sure that we have access to this. There's enough over here now that we've got to make this available without a prescription. We got to remove the barriers. This ought to be like syrup of Ipecac anymore. It ought to be in every medicine cabinet, every emergency box. It ought to be in where you see a defibrillator, you ought to see that. That's how bad that problem is now. That's why it baffles me that this budget seeks to spend 3 times as much money on zero-emission vehicles than combating the fentanyl crisis. Can you tell me how this budget addresses the fentanyl crisis in any serious way?
Sure, Congressman, you've heard me rebut the cut narrative on DHS, and I'll continue to point out that DHS grows by over 9%, but specifically on the border with fentanyl, I think we have some common agreement here. I've been to the border. I've seen them pop off the sides of cars and drugs packed to the hilt. The cartels know that our land ports of entry, because that is where most of the drugs come through, don't have the technology in place to track. So they're willing to drive things through, lose some of their goods because they know they can get enough through. What are we doing to get that equipment?
That's what I'm asking, and I appreciate the fact that and I hope you're communicating that to the administration.
And that's why we have money to continue, and thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law, we had land ports of entry money. This would add more of that NII equipment to make sure we are scanning more cars that come through the border.
If you will, Ms. Young, I've been to the border 7 times since I've been a member of Congress. And the last time I was there, we were told that only 5 to 10% of the fentanyl that's coming in over that border is coming through ports of entry. Now, granted, we may be capturing 97% of that at the port of entry, but that's 97% of only 10% of the total fentanyl. So what are we doing to secure the border, to stop fentanyl coming across that border, to stop killing our citizens? What does this budget do to address that?
Well, one, I'm happy to talk offline about your analysis. Mine is that most fentanyl is coming through the land ports of entry, so technology will help. What we also need to do is make sure we are supporting the men and women down at the border. This budget funds CBP to hire 350 more Border Patrol agents. We have a border surge plan that I've not heard much interest in taking up, but we think it's novel. As migration flow changes, we are asking that depending on how many migrants are coming across, more money is released to help us deal with What will most likely be an increase.
Okay,
will go after
that's
May.
fine, but I'm failing to see how we're addressing this, because we are allowing American citizens to be killed as a result of fentanyl poison. You know, if we were to lose 300 people in a plane crash, we'd stop every plane from flying right now until we got it fixed. Yet we lose 300 people every day to fentanyl poisoning, and we don't do anything about it at the border.
We agree with you, Mr. Carter. That's why we have money here to help stop the crossing of fentanyl and to go after these cartels. We agree with you.
I don't see it in the budget, though.
After this, we can go through it, and I'll show you.
I will be glad to, because I need to know that this administration is serious about this.
I've worked on these issues a long time, and I'm happy to work with you.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you to the gentleman from Georgia. Would like to recognize now my friend from Kansas, Mr. Estes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Young, for being here. I know it's been a long day for you, and some of us coming in and out and going through the process. So I want to surface on 2 or 3 things and then a deep dive on a couple. I mean, one of the things that when we did passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, was intentionally addressing companies being motivated to leave the United States because of taxes. And we were seeing a lot of inversions, and even the Obama administration, President Obama, before President Trump came in, was talking about how bad inversions were. And since Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed in 2017, there have been no inversions, companies leaving the United States through that process. And that was the intention of making sure that we do that. So I'm really concerned, some of the things in the budget, going through and adding taxes back and defeating some of the value that was in that program of helping make companies stay here. And particularly as we've talked about, I mean, one of the things talk about raising $1 trillion from the global minimum tax, under the theory that it would prevent a race to the bottom in taxes around the world, when in reality, the underreporting process is going to allow other countries who've passed that law, which nothing's been brought before Congress yet, to be able to change the U.S. tax law to have that process. So I'm really concerned that the numbers in here for revenue are going to be worse than what moves forward. And part of the reason why that bothers me is, this past year, or this current year, we are borrowing 1 out of every $5 that we spend. I mean, 1 out of every $5 is spent. And the budget that's proposed for next year, 1 out of every $4 that's spent is borrowed. And to me, it looks like, as I go through the math, you're saying that the deficit's reduced by $3 trillion, but I just don't see that. When I look at the numbers, I look at, on S1, the table in the budget, and it talks about a $1.5 trillion deficit this year. Next year, that goes up. The next year, it goes up. A couple of years are stable, right about the same as this year, but then it goes up and goes up and goes up. And over the 10-year period on that table S1, it says that the deficit's increasing by $17 trillion. So I'm wondering where the claim is that it's $3 trillion less when it's going up $17 trillion over the 10 years.
Congressman, if you look on S2, we have a lot of S tables, I point out. If you look on S2 at the bottom, total proposals in the 2024 budget shows the year-over-year deficit reductions, and it adds to $2.9 trillion, the nearly $3 trillion we've talked about over many hours in this room.
Right, but if you look at the debt, actually continues to go up, which means that's more of a reflection of, just because we didn't raise the deficit $20 trillion, we can't claim that as a $2.9 trillion savings, because we are raising the deficit by $17 trillion over 10 years.
You can. I mean, yearly deficits feed into the debt, and you can't make deficits worse. It will make the debt problem worse. So it absolutely does help get our fiscal house in order to save $3 trillion with the president's policies.
But it doesn't save $3 trillion. It just means we spend $3 trillion less than we could have spent in other avenues. Because the debt actually continues to go up in this next 10 years, the breakdown for that. So I know a lot of discussion around that. I don't understand that math, that process going through there. I do want to hit one other quick point. I know this is a real quick to go through in 5 minutes, and you've been hit with a lot of different issues. But one of the things we talked about earlier was Social Security. And I don't see anywhere where the president proposes to save anything on Social Security. I mean, we look at, all the projections are out there that within 10 years, the trust fund will be depleted, that at that point in time, the projections are that it'll be a 23% cut in payments, monthly payments. So if you're making $1,000 a month in your Social Security payment, you'll drop down to $770. So what has the president done to fix that?
So Congressman, as we sit here in 2023, we absolutely, the budget speaks to this, want to work with people in Congress who have solutions for the trust fund running out of solvency in 2033. Today, unfortunately, we believe the largest crisis is those who have, as the ranking member pointed out, have policies that would cut Social Security benefits. This budget says the president will not do that.
Okay, so if I look at this, there's really nothing in there that helps Social Security over the next 10 years.
It
So
helps seniors
we'll have to
not
do that
lose
work.
benefits. Yeah.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Kansas, and now yield 5 minutes in recognition to Ms. Stephanie Bice from the state of Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Boyle, for hosting this hearing today. And thank you, Director Young, for being here. It looks like we're close to the end. So I want to start in Ranking Member Boyle's opening remarks this afternoon. He questioned or suggested that the U.S. Senate would be considering cutting Social Security, and he read a list of members. But I didn't hear a single House member mentioned. And in fact, Speaker McCarthy and Republican leadership have expressly stated that they are not interested in cutting Social Security benefits. So I find it a bit insulting that the other side of the aisle would be so disingenuous to sort of suggest that that's on the table. No member that I'm aware of here has filed legislation.
Would the gentlelady yield just for a second?
I would
since you
not.
invoked my name?
I want to finish my line of questioning.
Because I do have the quotes right here if you wanted them from House members.
There's been, and I wasn't allowed to finish, Representative Boyle, there's been no legislation filed to suggest that Social Security benefits are going to be cut. I find it disingenuous to speak to such thing. America is facing serious questions about the future with the budget, the debt ceiling, and markets being on the forefront of my constituents' minds. The president's answer to the budget is to make history by raising spending to the highest sustained level in American history, by increasing taxes to the highest sustained level in American history, and by bringing our nation's deficits to the highest sustained level in American history. This is not the direction the American people want to see our nation go, and this budget shows the president is out of touch and doesn't care. I want to pivot to energy. It's important to the state of Oklahoma. The Small Business Administration recently filed comments critical of EPA's oil and natural gas methane rule. The comment letter states that EPA's proposal will have a significant and disproportionate impact on small businesses. Oklahoma has many small businesses that are part of our oil and gas sector. The EPA's proposed rule will have a devastating impact on the future viability of those businesses. OMB will have an opportunity to weigh in on the EPA's rule before it is published. What will you do to protect small businesses from unreasonable and harmful aspects of the EPA's methane rule?
So Congresswoman, I'm unaware of the letter. I'm happy to look at whatever you receive. Was it from the Small Business Administrator?
I believe that is correct.
I'd be surprised by that, but I'm happy to look at that. And when it comes into OMB, as you know, it will be an OIR, the Regulatory Office review. We will not comment on how we review that regulation. That would be improper. We do take, as part of the 12866 process, from members of Congress, from outside organizations that have an interest in the rule, we do offer meetings to make sure that all of their positions are known and put into the record. So I promise you we will follow that process and make sure we have a robust 12866 process.
Thank you. In response to Representative McClintock's questioning earlier, you suggested that oil and gas companies have made record profits this last year and should pay their fair share. Is that accurate?
A little more nuanced, but I said profits were 200 billion last year.
Can
And
you
if-
share with members of this committee what the total losses for oil and gas companies were in 2020?
I do not have that, but
Okay,
I'm
would
happy
you be
to-
surprised to know that with just the 5 integrated super majors, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Chevron in total, the posted combined total losses for those 5 entities was $76 billion in 2020 in 1 year. And the reason I bring that up is that it is surprising to me that this administration would think that taxing the oil and gas industry would be a viable option in raising revenue. As you know, yes, oil and gas companies have been able to make a profit this last year, but this is a cyclical market. I come from the great state of Oklahoma, where 25% of our oil and gas, or I'm sorry, of our state revenues come from oil and gas. Some years it's great, some years it's really bad. And 2020 was one of those years. There were a record number of bankruptcies in the oil and gas industry, record number of job losses. And so to suggest that taxing the oil and gas industry is a way for you to be able to have a bigger budget and to a larger spend, I think is a detriment to the American people, because at the end, that's going to require us increasing goods and services cost. And that's a hit to Americans' pocketbooks. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, thank you. I yield back.
I think the gentlelady and I would like to yield 5 minutes to my friend Chuck Edwards from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Young, thanks for being with us this afternoon. I'm not going to ask a lot of questions about the budget. I know my colleagues have dug into that quite thoroughly and certainly exposed it for what it is. I've got 2 questions. One is going to be fairly simple. The other might not. We heard the ranking member earlier this morning mention that perhaps billionaires were not paying their fair share. Do you recall that statement or something similar to that?
I do.
And yet, this budget places new taxes. Not only does it raise taxes on the middle class by about $2,000 per year, but it places new taxes on anyone making more than $400,000 a year. Is that right?
Yes, including to extend Medicare, but not on middle-class families. Middle-class families don't make $400,000.
Okay, so let's talk about that for just a minute. If our concern is with billionaires, why was $400,000 the number that was chosen to draw a line and add a new tax bracket?
Congressman, I think, and I don't want to speak for the ranking member, but I will speak for the budget. One tax proposal to raise revenue is a billionaire tax. It also deals with hundreds of millionaires. That's one. Another goes after large corporations, not taking their tax rate back to 35% before the 2017 tax cuts, but to 28%. So I think we were talking about one particular focus, which was what we call the billionaire tax. But the president has made an ironclad commitment, while you continue to hear 400,000, is he wants to make sure he communicates clearly to the American people that none of these tax policies that are up for debate will he negotiate to raise taxes, including when we go to extension of the 2017 on those making under 400,000. It is a value statement.
But it does raise taxes on farmers and small businesses that might make $400,000. And I think that you hit the nail on the head when you said that the intent of this, and I think this is most conservatives' problem, is to raise revenue. To raise revenue that I know my colleagues have pointed out that this government, this body should not be spending. Are you aware, are you a small business or a farmer?
I am not either, just a child and grandchild of one.
Are you aware that folks in those positions that grow our country's food, that provide jobs for Americans, do not have a regular income. They don't make $400,000. Even if they make $400,000, they don't make it from year to year to year. Are you aware of that? I said I'd only ask one question.
I'm well aware that many assets are not income and are land and other equipment.
So I've asked one of my two questions. I'm going to try to keep it to two, but I do have some comments that I'm going to ask you a question about in just a minute, because you and I here are both messengers. You're messaging the president's budget. I'm messaging on behalf of small businesses, farmers, and folks in my district. And my gosh, five minutes goes so fast. The reality is, many years, folks are struggling, and they have to go take out loans to keep their business afloat. And to draw a line at $400,000, because everybody is looking for that breakout year, to draw a line at $400,000 is punitive to those folks for accomplishing what they want to, which is to have that breakout year. And after businesses and small farms have gone through what they've gone through, and let's run through that real quick, after enjoying the strongest economy ever under the Trump administration, they were hit with a pandemic. Many of them were forced to close. They were hit with inflation. The correction for the inflation was that interest rates needed to be raised. Now they're paying more on their debt in addition to the items that they were hit on inflation. And now they're being told that they're not doing their fair part, their part, that they're not paying their fair share. I suggest that is a slap in the face to small businesses and farmers. And it cripples growth, it stalls our economy, and it limits the possibilities for our American workforce. And my question is, as a messenger, would you take that back to the president?
I will, but if I can, Mr. Chairman, I know we're over time.
Please.
With regard to American farmers, and I feel strongly about this, and I've talked to Secretary Vilsack, as you know, he's done this a long time, so I'm privileged to be able to serve with him in the cabinet. You know, we've got to do something where only 10% of farmers make money in this country. What can we do to make sure these family farmers stay around? So you have my commitment. If we want to find solutions, it's going to take bipartisan. I know the Farm Bill is coming up this year. What can we do to make sure these family farmers stay around? So I commit to working with you and others, as Secretary Vilsack and others, look at how to reauthorize the Farm Bill coming up this year.
I'd just say we're talking about more than farm. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
I think my friend from North Carolina, and the time now has come, as much fun as I know you're having, and would love to go for another 2 hours. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Madam Director, but you've done, I'd say, an outstanding job just persevering through the questions. The President, I think, is well served by your candor and your constructive tone, and for the entire, for our first hearing, Ranking Member, I want strong debate. I don't want us to back down, shy away, pull punches. I just want it to be about the policy differences, and I want the American people to understand where we disagree and why we disagree, and the principles behind it, and the policies behind it, and then let the democracy, have its effect. And I know you're committed to that too. In the spirit of civility, why don't you give some closing remarks? I'll give just a few, and we'll let the good lady go about her way.
Happy to. First, if we learned just one thing over the last 3.5 hours, is that Shalanda Young knows her stuff. So thank you for being so knowledgeable about the budget, a consummate professional. It's an honor to work with you. I also congratulate you, Chairman, chairing your first committee hearing. Between this session and the session that we moderated in the CVC for all House members of both parties, with the CBO director. I think both were by and large conducted on a bipartisan basis and were informative. So I hope and believe that we've set a tone for hopefully the rest of these 2 years. One final comment I'll make is I understand Director Young has to do this all over again this afternoon in the Senate. I believe the
House Approps is doing this.
or House of Probes. I believe the Constitution has an amendment banning cruel and unusual punishment. So Director Young, you might have a lawsuit that I would support if you pursue it. But with that, I yield back to you.
Well, I thank my friend from Pennsylvania. Just a couple of comments, because it was mentioned multiple times about the Republicans' vision, budget framework, and the values that that will reflect in comparison or contrast with the ones that were articulated by you and discussed by our members today. Our commitment is there to get that budget framework out, to have this same robust debate, and again, to make that comparison about our vision for a stronger, safer, freer country, and to address probably most of the problems we agree on in terms of the needs, but probably disagree, and I know for me, in many ways, starkly disagree with how to address those, how best to address them to satisfy all stakeholders and the public interest and our taxpayers as fiduciaries. So that is forthcoming, and I commit to that to my ranking member and to my colleagues. And the principles will be reining in spending, because we believe that is a big problem. And we believe we can't get to the debt, and we can't guarantee our children that blessing of security and a stable economy and future without doing it. We also commit to growing the economy, and among other things that I hope will be clear about our budget. But thank you for your time and your long suffering and your great attitude. And with that, I will read my little remarks here that so I can take my gavel. We have got to get a bigger gavel for this is so disrespectful to a Texan. I think you know that as a good Louisiana country girl. This is not right. So we'll let it slide this time. I want to thank the director again for appearing today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and their answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit questions for any extraneous material for the record may do so within 7 days. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.